I only needed shelter. But that unfinished mosaic already knew my family.
She was 19 and cold, no room, no tuition, no family door left open, just a frayed canvas backpack, a tiny brick trowel wrapped in a sock, and $5 she had kept from cleaning motel rooms. And with that $5, she bought a ruined mosaic and tile kiln house outside St. Augustine in St. Johns County, Florida, a coquina-walled workshop the county maps stopped naming in 1968. Rain came through the roof in 3 places. The kiln mouth had cracked like a dry riverbed. The county said the building had been closed since 1997 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the unfinished sunrise mosaic on the eastern wall, in a sealed air pocket that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elena Reyes had been mending her whole life without knowing it. She learned the habit before she learned the word for it, in kitchens where chipped plates were kept because they still held soup, and in rented rooms where curtains were sewn from flour sacks because morning came too hard without them. Her first memories were not large ones. They were the worn corner of a formica table, the smell of wet cotton drying over a chair, the soft metal click of her mother's hairpins dropping into a saucer before dawn. They lived then in a narrow duplex behind a bait shop in Palatka, where freight trains crossed the river at night and shook the window glass in its putty. Her mother, Lydia, worked wherever a manager would hand her a schedule: laundry, daycare. A seafood counter where ice gathered under her fingernails until her hands looked powdered. There was no father in the house after Elena was 5, only a photograph in a cedar frame and the careful silence around it. Her father, Mateo Reyes, had been a tile setter, a deliberate man with square wrists and a habit of measuring twice, even when he was cutting cardboard. He had died from a lung infection that came after a wet winter and too many houses with mold behind the walls. Nobody called it noble. Nobody called it unfair where Elena could hear. Her mother put his tools in a blue milk crate, covered them with a towel, and carried them to the shed behind her sister's house. After that, the family spoke of him as if he had gone out to buy sandpaper and might return if nobody disturbed the air. Elena grew into a child who repaired hems without being asked. At school she kept pencil stubs until there was nothing left to sharpen. When other children tore their worksheets from spiral notebooks, she eased hers loose along the perforation and stacked the silver coils in a cigar box. Broken did not mean finished to her. Broken meant waiting. The only adult who seemed to understand that was her grandmother, Marisol Ibarra Reyes, who lived 12 miles away in a pink stucco cottage set low among orange trees. Everyone called her Abuela Sol, partly because of her name, and partly because she opened her curtains before sunrise and let the first light fall across every object she meant to touch that day. On Saturdays, Elena rode the county bus to her, carrying a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and whatever cracked cup or plate she had rescued from the week. Abuela Sol's cottage had a back room that smelled of vinegar, clay dust, linseed oil, and coffee gone dark on the burner. It was not a studio in the fine sense. There were no high shelves of labelled pigment, no polished work tables, no window made for north light. There was a door laid over 2 sawhorses, a bucket of river sand, cigar tins filled with broken porcelain, and a kiln the size of a kitchen stove with a dented thermometer wired to its side. There Elena learned to nip ceramic with wheeled pliers and listen for the right sound. A clean break gave a dry tick, a wrong one made the piece complain before it split. She learned to sort fragments by thickness, not colour first because proud edges caught light badly and made a mosaic restless. She learned that blue from one saucer did not match blue from another, that white could be milk, bone, chalk, shell, ash or rainwater, and that a face made from broken tile needed more shadow than a living face, because grout always told the truth. Abuela Sol worked slowly. She kept a yellow legal pad by the table and wrote down kiln times in a hand, so even and dark it looked printed by a careful machine. Cone 04, 7 hours, hold 20 minutes. Lead free clear thin coat, do not hurry. Ash glaze test 2 green. She had learned her trade from her own mother, who had learned from a Cuban tile maker in Ybor City, who had taken his patterns from Spain and his patience from poverty. That was the way Abuela Sol told it, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of settled accuracy. Every weekend had its ritual. First, sweep the floor before touching the pieces. Dust made bad joins, then wash the fragments in a basin with a spoonful of vinegar and lay them face down on a towel, then sharpen the chalk, then heat tortillas on the dry skillet, fold them around scrambled egg, and eat standing beside the back door while the kiln warmed itself with soft pings and low breaths. After lunch, Abuela Sol would place one damaged plate in Elena's hands and ask her to study it, not to fix it, not yet, study first. Where was the break honest? Where had someone hidden a crack under glue? Where did the glaze still carry the maker's thumb? Elena would turn the piece over and over until the plate stopped being an object and became a history of pressure. One September afternoon, when Elena was 11, she grew impatient with a sunburst panel made from shards of amber and cream. The rays would not lie straight, the centre sagged, her glue skinned over before the last pieces settled. She pushed back from the table and pressed her palms under her thighs, ashamed of her own heat. Abuela Sol did not scold her. She lifted a crescent of yellow tile, held it to the window, and said the sentence Elena would carry farther than either of them could have guessed. A broken piece is not asking to be hidden. It is asking where it belongs. She did not say it tenderly, she said it as a tradeswoman correcting a measurement. The meaning came later in layers. At first it meant only that a chipped saucer did not belong in the trash if it could become part of a wing, a flower, a river, a hem of sky. Years afterward, when Elena had no address and no one waiting to unlock a door, it would mean that shame was not a map. It would mean that being cast out did not prove she had no place. It only meant the place had not yet been fitted around her. Abuela Sol died in June, when the magnolias were heavy and the air smelled too sweet to bear. She had been 72 and exact until the last week, still measuring coffee with a levelled spoon, still folding receipts into envelopes marked by month. The stroke came in the produce aisle of a grocery store, between limes and tomatoes, and she was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. After the funeral, the family moved quickly in the manner of people who feared that lingering might make them honest. Her cottage was cleared before the grass browned over the grave. The kiln was hauled away by a man with a trailer. The cigar tins vanished. The yellow legal pads did not appear on any table. Elena asked once about the blue milk crate that had held her father's tools, and her aunt Beatriz looked at her as if she had named a debt. "Things get lost when houses close," Beatriz said. That was all. The tiny brick trowel survived because Elena had taken it years before and hidden it in the lining of her backpack, not from theft, but from cleaning. It was only 6 inches long, with a wooden handle rubbed smooth by hands older than hers and a blade darkened at the point. Abuela Sol had used it for spreading thinset on test boards. It was too compact for a mason and too plain for a keepsake, which is probably why no one had wanted it. Elena kept it through high school the way other girls kept medals, ticket stubs, or photographs of boys in baseball uniforms. She kept it during the year she worked evenings at a motel near the interstate and mornings at a bakery where flour settled in the folds of her elbows. She kept it after she was accepted to a state college with a partial scholarship and a balance due that looked, to her, like a wall without a door. Her aunt had promised to help with that balance. Beatriz Alvarez had made the promise in front of 3 relatives, one pastor and Elena's mother. She had worn pearl earrings and a linen dress the colour of wet sand. By then she had taken charge of what remained of the family property, speaking of accounts and closings and taxes, as if grief were a ledger she alone knew how to read. She had a way of lowering her voice when she lied, not enough for the lie to become gentle, only enough that disagreement seemed rude. Beatriz lived in the house Elena's grandmother had never liked, a broad stucco place outside Ocala with a circular driveway and 2 stone lions at the steps. Inside, the air was always cooled past comfort. Nothing handmade stood where guests could see it. The furniture shone, the bowls were empty. Even the family photographs had been chosen for their frames rather than their faces. After Abuela Sol's death, Lydia and Elena stayed there because they had nowhere else to go. Beatriz said it would be temporary. then kept extending the word until it covered 2 years. Elena slept in a converted sewing room whose only window faced the air conditioner compressors. At night they started and stopped with a metallic shudder, and she would lie awake counting the pauses between them. Her mother had grown smaller in that house. Not in body, exactly, in permission. She laughed where Beatrice laughed. She agreed before questions finished. When bills came, she carried them to her sister's desk. When Elena received her college invoice, Lydia smoothed the paper with both hands and said they would speak to Beatrice after supper. They did. Beatrice listened from behind a glass-topped desk while Elena stood with the invoice folded in thirds. The sum was not grand by the standards of people who bought curtains by season, but it was more money than Elena had ever held at once. Beatrice tapped one fingernail against the glass. She said the estate had collapsed under medical debts, property taxes, repairs, obligations no one understood. She said sacrifices had been made. She said young people needed to learn resilience. 2 weeks later, Elena found a real estate brochure in the laundry room trash. It showed 3 luxury condominiums in Sarasota with pale floors, broad balconies, and a pool blue enough to look unreal. Beatrice's name was handwritten across the top margin beside a closing date. Elena did not take the brochure. She only looked at it until the dryer buzzer sounded and her mother came in carrying towels. Lydia saw the paper in Elena's hand. She saw the name. Her fingers tightened once around the warm towels, then loosened. "Put that back," she said. No anger, no defense, just the request. The eviction came on August 28, 2022, a Sunday of blunt white heat. Elena had worked the early shift at the motel, stripping beds after a wedding party and collecting the little soaps left unused near the sinks. When she returned, her backpack sat on the front steps beside a grocery sack. The sack held 2 changes of clothes, her toothbrush, a paper bag of apples, and the framed photograph of her father without its cedar frame. The frame itself was gone. The tiny trowel was still inside the backpack because Elena had never trusted drawers. A yellow envelope lay on top, her name written in Beatrice's careful hand. Inside were 5 $1 bills, the college invoice, and a note that said, in complete sentences, that the household could no longer support additional dependents. Beatrice opened the door only wide enough for her voice. "You cannot stay here after tonight." Elena. Child. 8 words, each one clean as a tile cut. Behind her in the dim hall, Lydia stood with one hand on the banister. She did not come forward. She did not shake her head. She did not reach for the grocery sack or say her daughter's name. She looked past Elena toward the driveway, where the heat made the stone lions tremble slightly in the air. There are betrayals that arrive with shouting, and there are betrayals that stand still and let someone else speak. Elena lifted the backpack first, then the grocery sack. The apples knocked against her knee as she stepped down. She did not ask where to go. She did not ask for the frame. At the curb, she stopped once and adjusted the strap on her shoulder because the buckle had turned and was biting her collarbone. That was the last thing she fixed before the road began. For 6 weeks she moved north and east by distances that looked modest on maps and endless in the body. Ocala to Palatka in the back of a church van after a woman at the gas station saw her counting change for water. Palatka to Jacksonville on a bus that smelled of diesel and damp wool, though summer had not yet loosened its hold. Jacksonville to Green Cove Springs in a delivery truck whose driver spoke only to ask whether she had people somewhere. She had $5 when she left. After the first bus fare, she had $3.35. After a biscuit and coffee from a station counter outside Middleburg, she had $1.90. She found pennies near vending machines, 2 quarters in a laundromat drain, and once under a picnic table a folded dollar so soft from rain it had to be dried between pages of a free newspaper. She slept where light did not linger, one night under the eave of a closed feed store, with the smell of molasses grain coming through the boards. 2 nights in the women's restroom of a bus station, waking whenever the fluorescent lights hummed louder. Another behind a Baptist church where a row of azaleas made a narrow shelter and sprinklers clicked on at 4 in the morning, soaking her shoes before she could pull them away. In Stark, a deputy told her she could not sleep on the courthouse lawn. He did not raise his voice. He waited while she gathered the grocery sack, then pointed toward a 24-hour diner where the night waitress sometimes let people sit if they bought coffee. Elena bought tea instead because it was cheaper. She held the paper cup until the heat left it, then used the tea bag twice. In Gainesville, she spent 3 afternoons in the public library because it had cool air, clean restrooms and tables where no one asked why her hands trembled when she wrote. She used a computer for 30 minutes at a time and searched for work that came with housing, dishwasher, stable hand, camp caretaker, grounds assistant. The listings asked for addresses, references, reliable transportation, steel-toed boots. She had none of those things. She still had the tiny trowel. Sometimes, before sleep, she took it from the sock and cleaned the blade with the edge of her shirt. There was no mortar on it, no clay, nothing practical to remove. The gesture gave her hands an order they could obey. By the 5th week, the nights cooled, not by much, but enough that concrete held less mercy. She reached St. Augustine after riding partway with an older couple selling boiled peanuts from a roadside stand, then walking the last miles beside a ditch where white egrets lifted themselves from the grass like torn paper. The city appeared first as traffic and signs, then as weathered walls, red roofs, iron balconies, and streets that seemed to remember horses better than cars. St. Augustine did not welcome her. Cities rarely welcome the poor in ways that can be measured, but it offered corners. It offered benches near the bayfront where tourists took photographs of the water and did not look too closely at a girl with a backpack. It offered the covered side of a closed tour booth on a rainy night. It offered, most merciful of all, the library on the corner, where the doors opened at 10 and the reading room smelled of paper, floor wax, and the sea carried in on people's clothes. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Elena found the classified ad because a printer jammed. She had been trying to print an application for a motel laundry job south of town. The computer took her last dime in credit and produced nothing but a blinked error message. A librarian with silver hair and square red glasses came over, opened the side panel of the printer, and pulled out a wrinkled sheet of newsprint someone had used as scrap paper. The page came loose with a dry sigh. "Not yours." "I take it," the librarian said. "No, ma'am." The librarian set it beside the keyboard and went to find a maintenance card. Elena glanced down only because the word auction had been circled in blue ink. County surplus and tax delinquent structures. Cash-only administrative sale. Properties may be unsafe, inaccessible, condemned, or without utilities. Purchaser assumes all obligations. Minimum bid $5. Below the notice was a list of parcel numbers and descriptions. Most were strips of land too narrow to build on, drainage easements, collapsed sheds, and one burned pump house. Near the bottom, in letters faded by handling, she read, "Former mosaic tile workshop and kiln house, Staint, Johns County, near Old Moultrie Road. Closed structure. Condemnation recorded. No warranty. Demolition pending if not transferred." Her finger stopped on the words mosaic tile. There are moments that do not announce themselves. No music rises. No room changes colour. A person simply sits in a public chair with cracked vinyl edges and feels some long-buried instrument inside her give one patient note. Elena read the listing again, then she copied the parcel number onto the back of her motel application. The sale was the next morning at the county building. She had exactly $5 again, gathered from found coins, one returned bottle deposit, and the rain-soft bill from under the picnic table. She had planned to use it for food, or bus fare, or both if she calculated carefully enough. Instead, she folded the paper and placed it inside the sock with the trowel. That night she slept badly beneath the covered walk behind a closed antique store on San Marco Avenue. Rain came after midnight, thin and cold, tapping the awning, darkening the bricks beyond her shoes. A horse carriage passed late, its wheels making a hollow wooden sound that seemed to belong to another century. Somewhere nearby, a restaurant emptied its bottles into a bin, green glass striking green glass. Elena did not imagine ownership, that would have been too large a word. She imagined only a roof she might stand under without being moved along. She imagined a locked door, even if the lock was rusted. She imagined a floor where she could lay the backpack down and know it would still be there in the morning. Before dawn, she washed her face in the library restroom after the outside door opened for staff deliveries. She combed her hair with her fingers, folded the grocery sack into the backpack to make herself look less temporary, and walked toward the county building with the 5 $1 bills flattened between the pages of a discarded tourist brochure. The streets were damp. The coquina walls held the grey light. A gull cried once over the parking lot and then went silent. At 9 o'clock, while clerks unlocked offices and men with folders joked about parcels they would never visit, Elena Reyes stepped into line with her small trowel hidden in her pack, and her whole inheritance reduced to $5, not knowing that the place waiting at the edge of the marsh still remembered her family's hands. The man ahead of Elena bought 3 drainage lots without asking where they were. He wore a straw hat with a black band and kept a pencil behind one ear, and when the clerk read the parcel numbers aloud, he nodded as if he were buying envelopes. Behind him, a woman in a red raincoat purchased a strip of land behind a motel, then laughed softly when told it had no road access. The room held 12 folding chairs, a flag, a plastic pitcher of water, and a clock whose second hand moved with a faint, blunt tick. Elena sat on the last chair with her backpack at her feet. No one looked at her long. That was one kind of mercy. Another was that the sale moved quickly, without ceremony, as if the county itself wished to be rid of these forgotten corners before lunch. A deputy clerk read the descriptions. A second clerk wrote names on a yellow pad, and the bidders raised hands, fingers, sometimes only eyebrows. Parcels passed from public burden into private uncertainty with the dry rustle of paper. When the Mosaic and Kiln house was called, no one raised anything. The deputy clerk read it again, a little slower, giving the room a chance to remember appetite. Former craft structure. Condemned. No utilities certified. No county maintenance. Purchaser assumes demolition risk. The straw-hatted man glanced back once, not at Elena, but toward the door. The woman in the red coat folded her bidder card in half. Someone coughed. Elena lifted her hand. It rose no higher than her shoulder. Her sleeve pulled back at the wrist, showing the pale line where her motel uniform watch had once rested. The deputy clerk looked over his glasses. The room was not unkind. It was worse than that. Perhaps. It was practical. Name, he said. Elena Reyes. The second clerk wrote it down. There was no contest. The gavel was a rectangular block of wood, not polished, not theatrical, and when it touched the table, the sound was modest, a sound like closing a drawer. Afterward came the bus. Not immediately. First came waiting beside a vending machine while the morning heat climbed the windows, then a paper receipt with a parcel number and a signature line she had not yet earned, then a direction from a woman behind the counter to go 3 doors down for deed processing because surplus transfers were handled separately and only on Wednesdays. Elena folded each paper carefully, though her fingers wanted to hurry. By the time she left the county building, the sun had burned the damp from the sidewalks. She walked to the bus stop near the plaza and stood beneath a laurel oak where the shade came in restless pieces. The bus that could take her partway south did not come until afternoon. She used the time to count her remaining coins twice, then a third time, not because the number changed, but because arithmetic could hold fear in one narrow cup. The ride lasted 28 minutes. She sat behind a man carrying a fishing rod and across from a nurse in purple shoes whose badge had flipped backward on its cord. The bus smelled of vinyl warmed by sun, old perfume, and the faint salt of work shirts. Through the window, St. Augustine passed in layers, Tourists near the fort, bright shirts, strollers, the stone face of old buildings, then gas stations, then repair shops, then houses with screened porches and yards where boats rested under tarps. She got off where the driver told her to, at a stop beside a closed produce stand with faded painted oranges on its sign. From there, she had to walk. The clerk at the transit window had marked the road in blue ink. Follow Old Moultrie, turn before the marsh widening. Do not take the subdivision road. Watch for the broken tile sign if it had not fallen. Elena tucked the page into her back pocket, then tightened the straps of the backpack until the canvas pulled flat against her shoulders. The first mile had sidewalks, the second had a shoulder of pale sand and bottle caps. By the third, the houses stood farther apart, each with its own arrangement of rust. Dogs, lawn chairs and patient shade. Cars passed with the fast wet sound of tyres over low places. A dragonfly hovered above a ditch green with duckweed. Heat rose from the road in visible layers, making mailboxes tremble in place. She walked 6 miles before sunset and did not reach the property. That was the first lesson in county maps. A line on paper did not know the weight of a backpack. It did not know hunger. It did not know the way a shoulder strap could soar at the same patch of skin until the body began to bargain with itself. By late afternoon, clouds gathered over the marsh, and the light turned the colour of pewter. Elena found a hay barn set back from the road behind a leaning gate. It was not empty, but it was not guarded either. Round bales stood beneath a roof of corrugated metal, and the air inside held the sweet, dusty warmth of cut grass saved from weather. She stood at the entrance for a long minute, listening. No voices, no engine. Only the settling creak of wood, the far call of a crow, and rain beginning to strike the metal overhead. She slept between 2 bales with her backpack under her head. The temperature fell to 47 degrees before dawn. She knew because a small thermometer hung from a nail near the barn door, its red line thin and exact. Her breath showed when she woke. Her shoes were damp at the toes. Something small moved in the hay above her, then stopped when she sat up. She ate 1 apple slowly, cutting bruised places out with her thumbnail, then walked back to the road while the east was still grey. By 8, she reached the first cluster of town. It was not St. Augustine proper, not the bright portion with carriage horses and old walls, but one of those outer settlements that live beside history rather than inside it. A place with a feed and seed store whose front windows displayed rubber boots, a laundromat called Sunbright Wash with 3 plastic chairs out front, a cafe named Doris's with pie written on a chalkboard sign, a hardware store under a striped awning, and a tax office in a bungalow where the porch lights still burned in daylight. Across from the cafe stood a barber shop with 2 chairs visible through the glass and a jar of combs in blue liquid. Beside it was a thrift store whose window held baby clothes, a brass lamp, a chipped punch bowl, and a painted wooden pelican. Elena paused there longer than she meant to, not because she wanted anything, but because the objects had been arranged with a kind of faith that someone would come looking for them. Her stomach tightened when the cafe door opened, and the smell of coffee and butter came out into the street. She kept walking. The county clerk's satellite office stood beyond the tax bungalow, in a 1-story brick building that had once been a bank. The outline of the old night deposit box still showed in the wall near the entrance, sealed with a plate of dull metal. Inside, the floor was terrazzo, worn smooth in grey and white chips. The air smelled of ink, copy toner, and a vase of artificial lavender that had gathered dust along its fabric leaves. A sign on the wall read, "Deeds, Records, Permits." Another sign read, "Take a number." Elena took number 18 from a red dispenser. The paper came out with a sound like a small complaint. There were only 2 people waiting. 1 man filling out a form with a carpenter's pencil, and 1 woman holding a folder against her chest. Behind the counter, 3 desks sat in a row, each with a computer, a stamp pad, and a stack of county envelopes. The woman who called Elena's number wore a navy cardigan despite the heat. Her hair was iron grey, cut blunt at the chin, with 1 white streak beginning above her left temple and disappearing behind her ear. She had narrow hands, a plain gold chain at her throat, and glasses suspended from a beaded cord on the counter. Before her stood a black name plate with white letter MRS. Nora Whitcomb. SNE or records clerk. She looked at Elena's receipt, then at Elena, then at the backpack. Surplus transfer, she said. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb turned to her computer and typed with 2 fingers, not slowly but with exact pressure. Her nails were short and unpainted. On the wall behind her hung a framed map of St. Johns County browned at the edges, and beside it a photograph of the county building from decades before, when the cars in front had round hoods and white wall tires. The printer beside her woke, hummed, and began producing pages. While it worked, Mrs. Whitcomb lifted the receipt again. You understand this is not a residential sale in the usual sense. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county has made no representation that the structure is safe to enter. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no active water account attached to this parcel. Yes, ma'am. No active electrical service. Yes, ma'am. No certificate of occupancy. Yes, ma'am. No guarantee that the roof, flooring, kiln, chimney, doors, windows, walls, or any other portion will remain standing. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Whitcomb paused then. The printer continued speaking behind her, page after page sliding into the tray. The clerk's face did not soften exactly, but something in the room slowed. You understand, she said, that if the building collapses, burns, floods, or is ordered removed, the cost may become yours. Elena's hands were flat on the counter. There was a crescent of dirt beneath one thumbnail that no library restroom sink had been able to lift. Yes, ma'am. The woman in the waiting chair shifted her folder. Outside, a truck passed, rattling the glass. Mrs. Whitcomb gathered the printed pages and tapped them into alignment. I am required to ask whether you have an attorney. No, ma'am. Whether anyone has advised you regarding liens or title defects. No, ma'am. Whether you are purchasing on behalf of another party. No, ma'am. The clerk looked at her over the rims of her glasses. Are you certain you wish to proceed? It was not spoken as kindness. It was not spoken as challenge. It was the question one careful person asks another before letting her step onto ice. Elena could have explained the backpack. She could have explained the apples, the restroom sinks, the library computer, the blue ink map, the tiny trowel. But explanations often ask the listener to become a judge. And Elena had been judged enough in rooms with good air conditioning. Yes, ma'am, she said. Mrs. Whitcomb slid the deed across the counter and placed a pen beside the signature line. The document was thicker than Elena expected, not in pages but in weight, county paper, cream-coloured, slightly rough beneath her palm. Her full name had been typed in capital letters, and beneath it the parcel description ran on with measurements, coordinates, and references to records older than anyone in the room. She signed where the clerk pointed. Her handwriting came out more childish than she wanted, the final S in Reyes slipping below the line. Mrs. Whitcomb checked the signature against the receipt, then opened a drawer and took out a brass-handled stamp. It was larger than Elena's hand. The clerk pressed it first into a black pad, then brought it down on the deed with a firm, practiced motion. The counter gave a dull thud. When she lifted the stamp, the county seal stood dark and wet on the page, all circles and official words. That makes the transfer recordable, Mrs. Whitcomb said. She stamped 2 more places, signed 1 page herself, tore a yellow carbon copy from the back, and tucked the remaining sheets into a long envelope. Then she took a road map from a file slot and drew the route with a green highlighter. "You will go out Old Moultrie until the pavement narrows," she said. "There is a cattle gate on the right that does not belong to you. Do not use it. Past that, you will see 2 live oaks and a mailbox with no door. The track beside it is yours for access. It will look private. It is not. It was recorded before the subdivision." Elena bent over the map. "How far from here?" 4.5 miles by road. "Less if you cut behind the church. But I would not advise that with your pack. Ground is wet." "Yes." "Ma'am." Mrs. Whitcomb folded the map once, twice, then stopped with her fingers on the crease. "Reyes," she said. Elena looked up. The clerk's gaze had moved from the paper to her face, as if trying to fit 2 pieces that did not quite admit they belonged together. "You any relation to Marisol Reyes?" The room went very still in Elena's hearing. The man with the carpenter's pencil had left. The woman with the folder was now at another desk. Somewhere in the back, a phone rang twice and was answered. "She was my grandmother," Elena said. "Mrs." Whitcomb removed her glasses and let them hang against her cardigan. Without them, her eyes looked lighter, more direct. "I was a girl when she came through here," she said. "Not this office. The main one. She filed repairs for a little place south of town. Always had clay on her cuffs. My mother bought a blue tile cross from her after the storm of 78. Elena did not move. "Mrs." Whitcomb turned toward the framed map, though she did not seem to be looking at it. She paid in exact change for every permit. Would not let my mother round down a fee. Said exact work, deserved exact records. A breath went into Elena and stayed there. The clerk put her glasses back on and slid the envelope across the counter. "I do not know what condition you will find," she said, "and I will not pretend otherwise. But the name is not strange to that road." For a moment Elena's hand rested on the envelope without taking it. There were kinds of inheritance that came with houses, money, and disputes over furniture. Then there were other kinds, small enough to pass through a county office on a weekday morning, carried in one clerk's memory of clay on a cuff. "Thank you," Elena said. "Mrs." Whitcomb nodded once. Then, as if the room had returned to its ordinary laws, she reached into a side drawer and took out a clear plastic sleeve. "Keep the recorded copy dry. If anyone asks, that is your proof until the permanent copy arrives. There is no mailbox service until you establish it, but the deed will be in the system by close of business." "Yes." "Ma'am." At the door. Elena turned back. "Mrs." Whitcomb had already called the next number. The walk-out felt different from the walk-in, though nothing visible had changed. The envelope rode inside Elena's shirt, flat against her ribs, protected from sweat by the folded map. She passed the cafe again. A woman with copper-coloured hair was setting a pie in the front window, using both hands beneath the tin. The hardware store door stood propped open with a cinder block. From inside came the smell of cut pine, machine oil, and seed packets. A dog followed Elena for half a block. It was a yellow dog, old around the muzzle with one torn ear and the careful manners of an animal that had chosen its own schedule. It emerged from the shade beneath a pickup truck and walked behind her at a distance of 10 feet, neither begging nor guarding. When she crossed the street near the tax office, it crossed too. When she stopped to adjust the backpack, it sat down and scratched at its collar. "Go home," Elena said quietly. The dog looked toward a porch where an empty rocking chair shifted in the wind, then looked back at her. After another block, it lost interest and turned into the alley beside the laundromat. Old Moultrie Road stretched ahead in a mild curve, but the day had gathered heat again, and every 100 yards seemed to ask for an answer. Elena walked past chain-link fences furred with trumpet vine, past a blue house with plastic flamingos in the yard, past a row of mailboxes leaning together like tired men outside a meeting. A neighbour in a straw visor watched from behind a screen door. Another man trimmed a hedge without turning off the clippers as she went by. The walnut trees came after the pavement narrowed. They did not belong to Florida in the easy way palms and live oaks belonged to it. They stood back from the road in a shallow rise, tall and dark, their trunks ridged, their leaves beginning to yellow at the edges. Beneath them the ground held old husks and fragments of shell crushed into the dirt. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks nearby, but not from the walnuts. They kept their own counsel. The mailbox with no door leaned beside a track barely wider than a cart. Its post had rotted at the base and been braced with 2 stones. No name remained on the box, only a rectangle of lighter metal where letters had once been screwed. Beside it, almost hidden by peppervine, stood the sign. It was made of tile. Most of it had fallen. The backing board had warped, and several letters were missing, but the fragments still held a line of blue along the border, and a yellow shape that might once have been the edge of a sun. Elena bent and pulled weeds away with both hands until she could read what remained. Sol Reyes tile and mosaic. Kiln work done by hand. The first name had lost 2 pieces. The word tile had cracked through the eye. But enough remained for recognition to move slowly through her body. Not like lightning. More like water filling a clay jar from the bottom. She stood there until a mosquito settled on her wrist. Then she picked up the largest fallen piece of the sign and laid it on the mailbox post. The track led inward under branches. Sand took the shape of old tires, then lost it where grass grew through. On the left, a drainage ditch held green water and the reflection of weeds. On the right, a fence had collapsed into a tangle of wire and wild grape. Lizards moved in the leaf litter. Twice she heard something larger retreat ahead of her, unseen but heavy enough to stir the brush. The building appeared not all at once, but in portions. First, the roofline low and uneven beyond palmettos, then a chimney of old brick, listing slightly toward the north, then the pale coquina walls, mottled with lichen and dark rain stains, their shells and ancient fragments visible in the stone like small bones. It measured perhaps 26 feet across the front and 40 feet deep, longer than it looked from the road, with a work shed added at the rear under a lower roof. The roof itself had once been red clay tile, but half the tiles were gone, and sheets of rusted metal had been patched over the worst places. The front door was cypress, swollen at the bottom, with iron strap hinges furred orange by weather. Above the doorway hung another sign, this one hand-painted on board, THH Mosaic and Tile Kiln House. Repairs, glaze, fired tile. The letters had faded to the colour of tea. A vine had grown through the O in mosaic and out again, as if the word had become a trellis. To the right of the front room, under a separate lean-to roof, was the kiln shed. Its brick arch mouth faced the yard, blackened and cracked, with a rusted damper handle above it, and a stack of broken kiln shelves leaning beside the wall. The chimney rose from there, square and stubborn despite its lean. Old firewood lay in a collapsed rack, silvered by years, most of it too rotten to burn. No glass remained in the left front window. In the right, Vone pane held, clouded with mineral fog. The sill beneath it had softened and sagged outward. Someone had nailed plywood across a side opening, but the plywood had peeled in layers, each one curling back like old bark. Elena did not step inside at once. She walked around the building slowly, not inspecting it as an owner, but approaching it as she had approached damaged plates in her grandmother's workroom. First, see where the break is honest. One corner had settled 2 inches, maybe more. Ferns grew in the gutter line. Ants moved through a crack near the foundation. The back room door had been chained shut, though the chain was red with rust and the hasp had pulled halfway from the frame. Behind the building, the marsh opened in a sheet of brown grass and silver water. Beyond it, the sky widened. Egrets stood at intervals in the shallows, each one still enough to seem placed there by a careful hand. The smell was salt mud, sun-warmed weeds, and something mineral from the coquina walls. She returned to the front. The county had given her no key because there had been no lock worth naming. A hasp hung from the door, but the padlock attached to it had rusted open and could be worked loose with 2 fingers. The door resisted anyway. It had swollen into its frame from years of damp, and Elena had to set her shoulder against it, then her hip, then push in 3 slow efforts until the bottom scraped over grit and the room exhaled. The smell came first. Dust, yes, but not the dead dust of sealed houses. This dust had salt in it. It had old ash, mouse paper, damp wood, dried clay, and the sour trace of leaves that had blown in and rotted along the baseboards. Beneath those was another scent, faint but stubborn, like earth after rain in a clay ditch. It reached her before sight did. The front room took the light unevenly. Sun entered through the missing pane and fell across the floorboards in a white rectangle broken by weeds outside. A long counter ran along the left wall, its top scarred by cuts, burns and round stains where jars had stood. Pegs remained above it, some empty, some holding loops of wire or a single cracked dust mask gone grey with age. On the right wall, shelves sagged under the weight of boxes, jars and bundled newspaper tied with string. The floorboards creaked, but did not give. Near the centre of the room stood a pot-belly stove, black and squat. One leg propped on a broken tile, its pipe rose toward the ceiling, then bent into the wall where soot had feathered upward in a dark fan. A chair without a seat rested beside it. On the mantel shelf above the stove lay 3 objects, a rusted awl, a blue glass button, and a wasp nest empty as paper lace. Elena stood still until her eyes adjusted. In the far wall, an opening led to the back room. The door that had once separated them was gone, leaving hinge scars and a darker rectangle on the frame. She walked through with one hand extended, not because it was fully dark, but because the air felt crowded by things waiting not to be knocked over. The back room was where the work had been. A broad table stood under a skylight patched with tin. Its legs had been braced more than once, and one corner rested on a stack of bricks. Along the south wall were bins divided by wood slats, many still holding tile fragments under a skin of dust, white, blue, ochre, bottle green, brown. A drawer hung open with handles inside it, as if someone had begun sorting and stopped. Against the eastern wall was the mosaic. It was enormous. Not finished, not clean, not even fully attached in places, but enormous as sunrise, or the idea of one spreading across plaster from shoulder height almost to the rafters. The lower half showed marsh grass made from greens and golds, each blade cut from chipped tile. Above it, water in slate and silver, then a horizon of broken coral, then the beginning of a sun whose rays had been laid in amber, cream, pale yellow and pieces of white so old their glaze had crackled into a network of fine lines. The centre of the sun was missing. Not empty exactly, covered perhaps. The circle where it should have been had been filled with a round cedar disc, stained dark, set flush with the surrounding plaster. Dust softened its edge. Someone had tacked burlap over part of it long ago, but the cloth had fallen away on one side and hung like a tired flag. Elena did not touch it. The light from the patched skylight shifted as clouds moved over the sun outside. The room dimmed, then brightened. In that change, the mosaic seemed almost to breathe. Not alive. Not magical. Only made by hands that had known how to place brightness where ruin could not fully take it. She set the backpack on the work table. The sound of it landing seemed too loud. For the first time in weeks her belongings were not on her body. That fact alone loosened something in her shoulders. Though the room was dirty, condemned, without water, without electricity, without any promise except walls, she took out the county envelope and laid it flat beneath a loose brick so it would not curl. Then she removed the tiny trowel from its sock. It looked different there. Not larger. Not finer. Only returned to the kind of room that understood it. She placed it on the table with the blade facing the mosaic, as her grandmother had once placed tools before beginning work. Then she swept the table with her sleeve, raising dust that smelled of clay and thyme. The first evening inside the Kiln house was not comfortable. Comfort belonged to people with clean sheets and working faucets. Elena's work was more basic. She cleared glass from the front room with 2 pieces of cardboard. She pushed the chair without a seat into a corner. She found a broom with half its straw missing and used it until the handle blistered her palm. When a palmetto bug ran from beneath the counter, she stepped back, waited for it to disappear, and continued. There was a well outside, but the pump handle gave only a dry groan. She would have to find water in the morning. There was an outhouse at the edge of the brush, leaning but upright, with a door that closed if lifted first. She tested the floorboards by standing on the edges, then in the center. They held. Near the back, she found an enamel basin with a rust hole and a stack of old newspapers from years she did not allow herself to read yet. At dusk, mosquitoes came through the broken window. She used a piece of burlap from the back room and wedged it over the opening with 2 strips of loose lath. It did not seal anything, but it slowed the air and gave the room the suggestion of privacy. Outside, frogs began in the marsh, then insects, then the far occasional sound of traffic, softened by distance until it seemed less like engines and more like surf. She did not make a fire. The chimney could have been blocked, the stove cracked, the pipe loose. Abuela Sol had taught her never to trust an old flue because smoke remembered every careless person. So Elena ate the last apple and drank from the bottle she had filled at the clerk's office restroom. She saved 2 inches for morning. The floor near the potbelly stove was the driest place she could find. She spread an old canvas drop cloth there, shook it twice, then folded part of it under her hip for padding. The backpack became her pillow. The county envelope stayed under the brick on the table, visible from where she lay. For a long time, she kept her shoes on. The house settled around her, coquina cooled after sunset with tiny clicks. In the kiln shed, some loose metal shifted once in the wind. A mouse moved inside the wall, travelling steadily as if following a known road. Rain began after midnight, light at first, then firmer. It found the roof holes one by one. A drop struck a bucket she had not noticed. Another tapped the floor near the back room opening. A third fell into dust with a darkening sound, no louder than a fingertip touching flour. Elena lay awake and learned the pattern. There was fear in the room, but it was not the fear of being sent away. It was older and less personal. The fear of rotten beams, hidden snakes, unpaid fees, men with authority, weather, hunger, and the long work of mourning. Those things were real. They had edges. Edges could be studied. Near dawn, she slept. When she woke, grey light filled the front room, and the rain had stopped. Her cheek was creased from the seam of the backpack. Her right hand had found the tiny trowel sometime in the night and closed around the handle. She opened her fingers slowly. The room remained. The table remained. The mosaic waited in the back, unfinished and patient, with its missing sun turned toward the day. The house had been waiting, and now Elena had begun to wait with it. By the second morning, Elena knew which floorboards lied. The one nearest the front counter groaned before it took weight, but held as long as she stepped along the nail line. The board beside the stove stayed silent until her heel touched the center, then answered with a sharp wooden pop that travelled into the wall. In the back room, the plank before the mosaic sounded hollow in damp weather and solid when the sun warmed it, which made her distrust it more than the others. She moved through the kiln house with the patience of someone learning a language from a person who did not speak loudly. Every place had its grammar. The front room wanted weight carried near the walls. The back room wanted windows opened before any dust was stirred. The kiln shed wanted distance, because the brick arch had slumped on one side, and the crack above it held a thin vein of daylight. The well did not give water the first day. Elena primed the pump with the last of what she had saved in the bottle, then worked the iron handle until her arm burned. The pump coughed once, gave a brown thread, then quit. She waited, tried again, and heard only a dry sucking below, as if the earth were clearing its throat and refusing to answer. By afternoon she had walked back toward the road with the empty bottle and filled it from the spigot beside a church cemetery after asking a groundskeeper in a canvas hat. He did not ask where she lived. "Fill 2 if you got 2, he said. She had one. The outhouse stood 23 paces beyond the rear corner, past a tangle of lantana and wild grape. Its roof was crooked, and the crescent cut into the door had lost its upper horn. Inside, a wasp nest hung in one corner, deserted, its paper chambers grey as ash. Elena swept the seat with a branch, tested the floor with one foot, and found that the right side dipped but did not collapse. She propped the door shut with a brick because the latch had rusted away. On the third day she cleared a path from the front door to the kiln shed and from the work table to the back exit. She did not try to clean the whole place. A whole place could defeat a hungry person before breakfast. Instead she made passages, a swept lane, a cleared shelf, one window uncovered, one bucket placed beneath each leak, one corner where the backpack could rest without touching damp. She learned the sounds after dark, the tick of coquina cooling, the pipe knocking when wind moved across the chimney cap, the wing beat of something small in the rafters, probably a bat, though she never saw it directly. She learned that rain on rusted sheet metal was different from rain on surviving clay tile, sharper and less musical. She learned that marsh wind entered through the broken panes, turned once around the stove and left beneath the door. By the fourth morning, hunger had become more organized than fear. She walked back toward the settlement with the county map folded in her pocket and the trowel wrapped in its sock inside the backpack. The cafe was open, and the scent of biscuits came into the street in waves. She passed it with her eyes on the sidewalk. The hardware store waited under its striped awning, the door propped open, the bell tied to the handle with a strip of leather. Inside, the place was deeper than it looked from the road. A center aisle ran between stacked paint cans, garden gloves, galvanized buckets, mop handles, and seed packets turning pale in their rack. The left wall held drawers of nails and screws, each with a handwritten label. 8-penny common, 16-penny sinker, brass escutcheon pins, masonry anchors. A row of glass jars sat behind the counter, full of washers sorted by size. The air was dry and dense with cedar shavings, fertilizer oil and dust warmed by fluorescent tubes. The man behind the counter was filling a coffee can with roofing nails from a scale. He was tall in the bent way, as if height had become less useful to him and he had set part of it down. His beard was white, his skin sun-browned, and the left lens of his glasses had a small scratch shaped like a comma. He wore a green work shirt with the name Arthur stitched over the pocket, though the wooden sign above the register read, Hollis Hardware, EST, 1949. He looked at Elena's shoes first, then the backpack, then her face. "You lost," he said. "No, sir." "Then you are looking for something." "Yes, sir." He set the scoop down, wiped one hand on a towel, and waited. "I bought the tile place off Old Moultrie," she said. Arthur Hollis did not answer quickly. His eyes moved once toward the window, as if the road outside might confirm or deny her. Then he put the lid back on the coffee can of nails. "County finally got somebody to sign for it." "Yes, sir." "You got people helping." "No, sir." "You got money." Elena rested both hands on the counter's edge. "No, sir." That made the store still. Not silent, because a ceiling fan clicked and a refrigerator near the back hummed around bottles of soda, but still in the manner of a place where the next sentence matters. Arthur looked down at the counter. There were knife marks in the wood. Burn marks too. Names carved by men long grown or dead. "What do you need first?" he asked. It would have been easier if he had dismissed her. Easier to take pride and leave with nothing. Instead, the question entered the exact place where pride had worn thin. "Water," she said. Then chimney. Then roof. Chimney before roof. "I know." He studied her again. Not warmly. but with a kind of trade attention. You know, because somebody told you, or you know because you know, my grandmother fired tile. She taught me not to trust an old flue. The scratched lens caught the light when he lifted his head. Name, Elena Reyes. Arthur's hand stopped on the towel. He folded it once, carefully, and placed it beside the register. I knew Marisol, he said. Not well. Enough to sell her firebrick and hear her correct my math. Elena felt the same held breath she had felt in the clerk's office, but this time she was tired enough that it nearly bent her. She did that, she said. She did, Arthur replied. Paid for 1 box of tile spacers with 32 dimes and would not let me skip counting. He turned and took a ledger from beneath the counter. Not a computer ledger. A real one, with marbled covers and pages ruled in blue. He opened near the back, licked the end of a pencil, and wrote her name on a blank line. I can run a house account. I cannot promise when I can pay. I did not say a charge account. I said a house account. Different animal. You take small, necessary things. I write them. You pay when the place can breathe. If it never does, I will have made worse mistakes. Elena looked at the page. Her name stood there with nothing beside it yet. I do not want charity. Arthur's mouth moved almost into a smile, then decided against it. Good. I am not fond of giving it. This is credit with a long rope and a witness. He reached under the counter again and pulled out a soft-covered manual, its spine cracked, its cover showing a drawing of a man repairing a brick chimney with a trowel too shiny to have done work. County used to give these out, he said, before everyone decided knowing how to fix what they owned was dangerous. You can keep it. Page 37 for flues. Page 62 for glazing sash. Roof starts at 91. Do not trust the illustration on step 4. It is drawn by a fool. Elena ran one finger over the cover. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Read before touching anything above your head. He made her list the first needs aloud, then corrected them without softness. Not paint, not curtains, not lime wash. First a 5-gallon water jug with a screw cap used but clean, 2 cotton rags, work gloves from the clearance bin, fingers too long but leather still sound, a wire chimney brush 6-inch round because anything larger might jam in an old flue, 3 flexible rods at 4 feet each, second hand, 1 dust mask, a cheap flashlight with batteries, a coil of mason's line, 1 box of contractor bags, a small bottle of dish soap, a tin of stove cement. Arthur wrote prices in the ledger as he spoke. Water jug, $2. Rags, no charge because they had once been seed sacks. Gloves, $3.50. Chimney brush, $7 used. Rods, $4 for the set. Mask, $1. Flashlight, $2.75. Batteries, $1.20. Mason's line, $1.10. Contractor bags, 5 for $1. Dish soap, 89 cents. Stove cement, $3.40. The total looked impossible and modest at once. Arthur turned the ledger toward her so she could see it. $30.84. I only have 12 cents. I heard you the first time. He packed the items into a cardboard box that had once held cabbage seed. Then he went to a shelf behind the counter and added a tin cup with a chipped enamel rim. This is not on the account. It is old enough to be tired of sitting here. I can use the jug. You can. You can also drink like a human person when the day is poor. Elena lifted the box. It was heavier than she expected. Arthur came around the counter and tied it with twine so she could carry it against one hip. At the door, he spoke again. Do not climb the roof alone. She turned. I was not going to. That means you thought about it. Yes, sir. Stop. Yes, sir. The walk back took longer with the box. Twice she set it down in shade and flexed her fingers. At the mailbox without a door, she found the yellow dog sitting under the walnut trees, as if he had been appointed to receive her. He watched while she shifted the box to the other hip, then followed her down the track until a squirrel offended him from the fence line and he trotted away. The chimney took one full day to understand and most of the next to begin. Elena laid the manual open on the work table and weighted the pages with tile fragments. Page 37 explained how to inspect a flue from below with a mirror and light. She had no mirror, so she used the reflective back of a broken picture frame found behind the counter. Holding the flashlight in her teeth and angling the glass above the stovepipe opening, she saw only blackness thick enough to seem material. First, she disconnected the stovepipe. It resisted. Every joint had been painted over with soot, rust, and old stove cement, and the screws had fused into the metal. She soaked them with a few drops of cooking oil found in a tin, waited an hour, then used the edge of a rusted screwdriver from a drawer to worry them loose. One screw snapped, one turned, one had to be gripped with pliers and coaxed a quarter turn at a time while her knees pressed into grit on the floor. When the pipe came free, flakes of creosote fell out in curled black scales. The smell was bitter, tarry, and sharp enough to wake the back of her throat. She spread newspaper beneath the opening, tied the dust mask behind her head, and fitted the first rod to the brush. The manual said to work steadily, not violently. Let the bristles scrape. Do not jam. Do not force past a bend. She fed the brush upward into the flue until it met resistance, then turned, lifted, lowered, turned again. Creosote came down like burned cornflakes. Some pieces were dry and brittle, others were glossy, almost glassed by old heat, and stuck to the newspaper with a greasy mark. She added the second rod, then the third, working from below because the roof was not safe. After 40 minutes her arms shook. After 2 hours, black dust had settled on her eyelashes, her wrists, the collar of her shirt. She rested, drank from the tin cup, and began again. At noon, she stopped to inspect the stove. The potbelly had a hairline crack along the back seam and a door gasket that had once been rope but was now powder. She cleaned the seam with a nail, dampened it slightly, and pressed stove cement into the crack with the tip of her tiny trowel. The tool fit the work so perfectly that she had to sit back for a moment afterward, not from feeling, from recognition. Its blade, made for narrow joins and careful pressure, moved through the black paste as if this grim little repair belonged to the same family as tile. By late afternoon, the flue began to answer differently. At first, the brush made a muffled scrape, then a clearer rasp, then, near the top, a faint shift of air touched her face. She removed the rods, carried the creosote outside in a contractor bag, and left it beside the kiln shed away from the wall. She swept the hearth twice, then used a rag to wipe the stove door and the collar where the pipe would return. It took 3 more hours the next day to clean the pipe itself. She carried each section outside, tapped it gently with a stick, then drew the brush through by hand. A half-cup of soot came from the elbow alone. A bird skeleton, delicate and incomplete, fell from the longest section and lay on the newspaper with one claw closed as if still holding a twig. Elena wrapped it separately and buried it under the walnut tree, not because she had time for ceremony, but because some small decencies cost nothing. The first fire was no larger than both her hands. She used dry twigs gathered from beneath the live oaks, 3 curls of newspaper, and 1 split of old wood from the rack that still held a pale centre before lighting it. She checked the damper, checked the pipe joints, checked the stove cement, and set the water jug near the door. The match flared sulphur yellow, then settled, paper caught, twigs took, smoke moved upward instead of outward. She crouched before the stove and watched. The draught was weak at first, then steadier as the flue warmed. A thread of smoke leaked from one pipe joint, and was stopped later with a thin press of cement. The stove clicked. The room changed temperature by degrees so small, only the body could count them. After weeks of cold meals and damp corners, heat did not arrive as luxury, it arrived as permission. That evening, Elena cooked rice in a dented pot found under the counter after washing it 3 times with boiled water and soap. She added half a bouillon cube Arthur had slipped into the box without writing it down. The rice stuck to the bottom. The smoke smell remained in the room. Mosquitoes still found a way through the burlap. It was the first hot meal she had eaten under a roof that belonged, however uncertainly, to her. She ate from the enamel cup because she had not yet washed any bowls. Each spoonful was plain, salty, and slightly burned. She scraped the bottom clean. After the chimney, she allowed herself the back room. Not all at once. Methodically. She opened one box at a time. Vone drawer. Vone wrapped bundle. The inventory began on the back of a county envelope flap, then moved to a school notebook she found in a cabinet with half its pages unused. She wrote the date at the top, as Abuela Sol would have done. South wall bins, white field tile, broken, mixed thickness. Blue border pieces, approximately 47 usable. Green glaze fragments, many crazed, likely not frost-safe. Amber shards from plates, not tile. Black tesserae, handmade, square-cut, dirty but sound. Lower shelf, 3 jars dried glaze, labels unreadable. 1 jar cobalt stain, sealed with wax. 1 bag silica, torn. 1 bag kaolin, clumped. 1 tin marked copper carbonate, do not inhale, lid tight. 2 Kiln cones wrapped in newspaper, cone 06 and cone 04. 1 pyrometric chart, mouse chewed. Center table drawers, tile nippers, rusted. Glass cutter, handle cracked. 2 wooden floats. 1 grout bag stiffened beyond use. Chalk line reel without chalk. Putty knife. AWL. Small hammer. Head loose. Sponge hardened into the shape of its bowl. Twine. Pencil stubs. North Cabinet ledgers. 1976 through 1981. Damp at edges. Receipt books. A cigar box of buttons. 4 envelopes of photographs stuck together by humidity. Cotton gloves browned at the fingertips. A folded apron stiff with clay. Kiln shed, fire brick stack, some spalled. Kiln shelves. 6 broken, 2 whole posts. Assorted heights. Iron rake. Ash shovel. Wood tongs. Bucket of grog. 2 cracked saggers. 1 rusted oil can. 1 length of stovepipe unrelated to stove. She did not read the ledgers yet. Reading belonged to evenings when work had earned it. For now, the room needed hands, not memory. On the 5th day, she cleaned the bins. She wore the dust mask and used the rag dampened just enough to hold powder. She sorted fragments by thickness, then by colour family, then by whether the glaze could be saved for display or only for fill. Some pieces were clearly scrap from commissions. Bits of letters, a fish scale pattern, a woman's eye, part of a blue heron wing. Others had been practice cuts, uneven and shy. Every so often, she found a piece that stopped her. A narrow ray of yellow, beveled at one end. A curve of coral orange. A sliver of white with crackle glaze, cut to meet a circle. They belonged to the sunrise on the wall. She carried them there, held them near the missing centre, and saw where some might have gone. Not yet. The wall was not ready. The room was not ready. She was not ready. The anomaly announced itself through sound. She had been cleaning along the eastern wall, where dust gathered on the lower edge of the mosaic, and mud daubers had built nests between raised tiles. The sun's cedar centre remained untouched except for a careful wipe with a dry cloth. Around it, the rays had been set into old plaster. Some pieces were loose, Some were gone, most held. When Elena tapped one amber ray with the wooden handle of her trowel, it gave the expected note. High, hard, attached to plaster. When she tapped another, lower on the circle, it gave the same, but when the handle touched the cedar disc, the sound was not wood against wall, it was wood over air. She froze, then she tapped again, lighter, hollow, not the hollow of rot, not the dull softness of termite damage, a chamber hollow, a space deliberately made. The disc itself was about 18 inches across, dark with age, its grain running horizontally around its edge, tile rays pressed close, their grout lines narrow, no visible hinge, no knob, no screw heads. She knelt, brought the flashlight near, and saw 4 tiny wooden plugs set into the disc along the compass points. Cedar plugs, darker than the surrounding face because dust had collected around them. She did not pry. First, she tested weight, pressing both palms against the disc. She leaned carefully. It did not move inward. Pressing one side, then the other, she felt no give. She tapped around the edge and listened. Hollow behind the center, solid behind the rays. The compartment, if there was one, sat within the sun itself. She went back to the work table and found the awl. The first plug splintered when touched, too dry to lift clean. She stopped, sharpened a pencil with her pocket knife, and sketched the disc in the notebook, marking each plug location. Then she used the awl not as a lever but as a needle, loosening the edge of the second plug grain by grain. It took 20 minutes to raise it enough to grip with her fingernails. Beneath was the blackened head of a hand-cut screw. A screw meant access. She cleared all 4 plugs before attempting the heads. The top screw turned reluctantly after she pressed hard and kept the screwdriver exact in the slot. The right one refused until she tapped the handle twice with the loose hammer. The lower screw came out with a faint red powder of rust. The left screw broke at the head. Elena sat back on her heels. The room held its breath around her in the ordinary way a room does when rain is coming. Outside, a bird called from the marsh. The cedar disc remained in place. For the broken screw, she used the smallest blade in a rusted set of chisels. Slowly, she pared a shallow groove beside the stump. Then she slid the tip of the brick trowel into the seam and turned it no more than the width of a dime. Something inside gave a dry click. The disc did not fall. It loosened. She gripped the lower edge with both hands and drew it outward. It came free with resistance, bringing with it a ring of dust and the smell of cedar closed too long. Behind the disc was not a deep room, but a circular air pocket lined with boards, perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, built within the thickness of the wall where the old chimney mass met the plaster. It was clever, compact and dry. Inside were packages, 3 wrapped in waxed cloth, 1 narrow wooden case tied with cotton tape, 1 square tin box, the colour of dark tea, a bundle of letters in oilskin, a smaller parcel stitched shut with red thread. Everything had been placed deliberately, not hidden in panic, but kept. Elena did not reach in at once. She stood, walked to the front room, opened the door, and breathed outside air. The yard lay in late afternoon light. The walnut leaves moved without urgency. Mosquitoes gathered near the ditch. The world continued to be made of weather and insects and unpaid accounts. Then she went back in and washed her hands in a basin with the last clean water. The first waxed package held tools, not valuable to a collector perhaps, but valuable to a hand, a pair of tile nippers wrapped in oiled cloth, their spring still responsive, a narrow-margin trowel with a rosewood handle and initials burned into it, MIR, a set of steel picks for cleaning grout joints, a tiny brass plumb bob, a bone folder worn at the edge, a wooden-handled glaze brush whose bristles had been protected inside a paper tube. At the bottom was a folded cloth apron, washed thin, with 2 deep pockets, and a patch sewn over one corner. Elena laid each object on the table in a row. The second package held raw material, small sealed packets labelled in the even hand she knew from childhood Saturdays: cobalt carbonate, iron oxide, rutile, copper wash, weak, tin white, mason stain yellow. There were also 5 test tiles, each marked on the back with cone numbers and percentages. One glaze had pooled blue at the lower edge like evening water. Another had broken into gold flecks over dark brown. A third was plain cream, but when she turned it to the window, tiny specks emerged, as if sand had learned to The third package held tile blanks, unfired or bisque-fired, wrapped between sheets of brittle paper. Squares, triangles, long narrow rays, a stack of circular pieces cut for some centre medallion never completed. Their edges had been smoothed by hand. Elena touched one with the pad of her thumb and felt the fine tooth of clay waiting for glaze. The wooden case opened with a brass clasp. Inside, nestled in cotton, lay a set of wheeled glass and tile cutters, better than anything in the drawers. German steel, perhaps. The handles darkened by oil. One wheel turned freely when she nudged it. Another needed cleaning. A slip of paper beneath them read, "For the person who knows enough not to force them." The red-stitched parcel held photographs. She did not examine them fully, only separated them enough to see faces. A kiln shed before the roof had sagged. A woman in an apron standing before the unfinished sunrise. 2 children holding tile birds. A group of people gathered around a long table under the walnut trees. On the back of one, in pencil, someone had written, "First winter orders for the home." The tin box was heavier than it looked. Elena carried it to the work table, then stopped. Her body knew before her mind did that weight like that meant money or metal. She did not open it standing. She sat on the floor with her back against the table leg, the box between her knees, and lifted the lid. Inside were bank envelopes, coin rolls, folded bills, and a smaller velvet pouch. A smell of paper, metal, and cedar rose from the tin. She closed the lid, then opened it again. Counting took most of the evening and part of the night, because she would not hurry. She cleared the table, washed it again, dried it with a rag, and made columns. 10s, 20s, 50s, 100s. Older notes in a separate stack because their paper felt different. Coin rolls by denomination. Loose coins on a plate. There were bills from different years, some crisp, some soft from handling, all folded in bank bands or envelopes marked in pencil. Roof fund medicine after March, do not spend unless needed. Children's shoes, kiln brick, winter coal. One envelope had no label, only a pressed fern inside with 2 $20 bills. The total in bills came first, $37,480. She wrote it down, checked it twice, then a third time. The coin rolls added $498.50, mostly quarters and half-dollars, with a few rolls of silver dimes. The loose coins added $21.87. There were wheat pennies, buffalo nickels rubbed almost smooth, Mercury dimes, Roosevelt dimes, Washington quarters, 2 Franklin half-dollars, and 1 1922-piece silver dollar wrapped by itself in tissue. The velvet pouch held 3 gold coins, not large, each in a paper sleeve, a 1911 Indian head half-eagle, a 1907 Liberty head half-eagle, and a 1925 quarter eagle. Arthur would know what they were worth, but Elena did not write any guessed value beside them. At the bottom of the tin lay a military medal. It had been wrapped in a handkerchief gone ivory with age. A bronze star-shaped medal hung from a ribbon faded nearly brown, and on the back, engraved in letters so small she had to bring the flashlight close, was a name she did not know yet and a year, 1951. Beside it was a folded newspaper clipping too fragile to open safely in the dim room. She placed the medal apart from the money. When everything was counted, the written total, not including the gold coins, stood at $38,000.37. Elena stared at the number until it stopped behaving like a number. The room had darkened completely except for the flashlight standing on its end and throwing a cone of light toward the ceiling. Outside, rain began again, soft first, then steady. One leak struck the bucket in the front room. Another found the contractor bag near the wall and made a dull plastic tick. The stove had gone cold because she had forgotten to feed it. She did not laugh, she did not cry, she did not press the money to her chest or speak to the empty room. She sorted everything back into careful order, because that was what her hands knew how to do when the world became too large. Bills into envelopes, coins into rolls, metal into handkerchief, photographs into their parcel, tools in a row beneath the window, not hidden now, but not exposed either. The bundle of letters remained. Oilskin. Cotton string. A top envelope addressed in the handwriting she knew, but older, darker, more formal than the notes from the weekend work table. The sight of it changed the air more than the tin box had. Money was danger and shelter both. Tools were inheritance. But handwriting was a voice held behind paper. Elena untied nothing. She sat with the bundle before her until the flashlight dimmed slightly and the cone of light yellowed. Her body was sore from kneeling, her fingers blackened with cedar dust and soot caught in old cuts. She wanted to read. She wanted not to read. Wanting both made her careful. At last she wrapped the letters again, set them beside the medal, and carried the tin, the packages, and the tools back to the wall compartment. She did not return the cedar disc fully. Instead, she leaned it in place without fastening it and moved the work table against the wall before it, not to hide the compartment from the house, but from any accidental eye at the broken window. Then she took the enamel cup and went outside. The rain had thinned to mist. The marsh beyond the building held what little light remained from the clouded sky, and the water lay in dark seams between grasses. Elena walked to the edge where the ground became soft, stopping before her shoes sank. Frogs called from every direction, patient and untroubled. A night heron lifted out of the reeds and crossed low over the water, its wings making no sound she could hear. She stood there a long time. Behind her, the Kiln house held its damaged roof, its cold stove, its unfinished wall, its hidden pocket now disturbed after years of silence. In front of her, black water reflected nothing clearly. The cup in her hand was empty. She had come outside for water, perhaps, or air, or because a person cannot sit forever beside a newly opened past without giving the present some place to breathe. At the edge of the marsh, with rain on her sleeves and cedar dust under her nails. Elena understood that nothing she had found belonged to appetite. It had been kept with purpose. It had been kept through weather, neglect, death, and someone's long decision not to spend it. The house had been waiting, and now Elena had begun to wait with it. Morning came in without brightness. A low fog had moved from the marsh during the night and pressed itself against the broken windows, beading on the burlap, softening the outlines of the walnut trees until their branches looked drawn in charcoal. Elena woke before full light, stiff from the floor and from the knowledge waiting under the cedar disc for several minutes. She did not sit up. She listened first. No rain. Only the slow drip from the roof edges, the faint scrape of a branch along the kiln shed, and the thin call of a bird she could not name. She built no fire. She washed her hands with a little water from the jug, dried them on the least dirty corner of the apron she had found, and carried the bundle of letters to the work table. The oilskin had darkened at the folds. The cotton string, though brittle, still held its knot. Someone had tied it for keeping, not for display. Elena loosened it with the tip of the tiny trowel. The top envelope had no stamp. No address beyond 4 words. For the one who remains. The handwriting struck her before the meaning did. Not exactly Abuela Sol's weekend hand, not the letters Elena had seen on legal pads and glaze packets, but near enough to stand beside it in the same family. The capitals were taller, the descenders longer. The pressure heavier at the start of each word, as if the writer had been forcing strength into the line. Elena touched the M in my, and her finger came away clean. She unfolded the letter along creases that had been made by the hand that wrote it. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this wall, then either the house has suffered enough to show its bones, or someone with patience has listened to it. I hope it is the second. I hope you came carefully. I hope you did not pry the cedar with a crowbar, because the disc was set with 4 screws and soft plugs, and any person who breaks what can be opened has not yet learned the trade. I am writing because Dr. Elias B. Warren of Flagler Hospital in St. Augustine told me on the 3rd day of May, 1981, that the pain in my side was not a passing thing. He said the word carcinoma with great courtesy, and courtesy is sometimes the cup men use to hand you bitter medicine. I do not know how much time I have, and I have grown tired of trusting memory to people who prefer easier stories. My name is Marisol Ibarra Reyes, daughter of Esteban Ibarra and Lucia Valdez Ibarra. My mother was born in Tampa in 1902, in Ybor City, where cigar smoke and kiln smoke both found their way into laundry. Her father, Tomas Valdez, came from Cienfuegos in 1888 and worked first in tobacco, then in tile, because Clay did not mind his accent. My father's people came from St. Augustine fishermen, Minorcan and Spanish both, and my grandmother, Ana Maria Solana, born in 1869 near the Old City Gate, could set a tile border by eye straighter than most men could with a rule. We were never wealthy people, we were exact people. There is a difference, and it may save you. The trade began closing around us on October 14th, 1929. That was the day a hotel man from Jacksonville cancelled 3 courtyard commissions by telegram, and 2 weeks later the banks began speaking in whispers. By spring, machine tile came cheaper by rail than hand tile came by wagon. Work slowed. Men left, women kept accounts. My mother fired small orders, house numbers, holy crosses, kitchen borders, grave markers, anything that could be paid for in coins, eggs, or repair labor. After the war years, people wanted smooth things, new things, things without the mark of a thumb. They called our work old-fashioned before it had even grown old. There were 30 years when almost no one asked for mosaic. 30 years when this kiln burned more for need than beauty. I kept it open because a closed kiln forgets draft, and because broken plates kept coming to me as if the town itself knew where to lay them down. I repaired what I could. I made what was ordered. I said very little. Silence can be a workshop too, if you use it honestly. You will find money here. Do not let it frighten you, and do not let it make you foolish. Some of it came from work, some came from sales I never told the family about. Some came from your great-uncle Raphael's army pay after he was killed in Korea in 1951, near a place the newspaper called Heartbreak Ridge. He had no wife and no children, and he told me in his last letter that if he did not return, I should put his pay where children could stand under a roof. My husband, Mateo's father, helped me carry envelopes to St. Gertrude's Home for Children for many years after that. Later, when he was gone, I carried them alone. Shoes, medicine, school fees, winter blankets, roof patching, bus tickets, one piano because Sister Agnes said music was not an extravagance if a child had already lost too much. I kept records, though not all in ledgers. Some kindnesses cannot be written down without making them smaller. If anyone calls this money hidden, let them. It was not hidden from greed. It was hidden from waste. If you mean to use the kiln, begin with humility. Sweep before you mix, wash each shard, sort by thickness first. A proud edge will catch a sleeve, a shadow, and eventually regret. For field tile, bisque slowly to cone 06, no faster than 150 degrees an hour after the water smoking stage. Let the kiln climb with patience to about 1830 degrees Fahrenheit. Hold only if the wear is even. For low fire glaze, 3 parts frit, 2 parts kaolin, 1 part silica is only a beginning, not a law. Add stain by weight, never by mood. Cobalt is strong enough to ruin a week. Copper will lie to you in a small test and confess on a wall. For mosaic mortar, use clean sand, hydrated lime, and white Portland in a 3:1:1 ratio for interior work. Wetter than bread dough, drier than cake batter. Butter the back of each piece. Press. Do not mash. Leave 1/8 of an inch where the eye needs rest. Grout when the setting bed no longer receives a fingernail, and wipe diagonally, always diagonally, or you will pull out your own care. Do not finish the sunrise quickly. If the cedar is still there, I did not finish it for a reason. A sun must be earned by the room around it. Repair the roof. Teach the chimney to breathe. Make the floor honest beneath your feet. Then, and only then, set the center. Inheritance is not possession. It is a task that has outlived its first hands. If you are blood of my blood, welcome. If you are not, welcome still, provided you work with respect. The house owes nothing to names. It answers patience. Outside, at the back, the walnut tree nearest the marsh holds a horseshoe grown into its west side. Beneath that tree is where I buried the first cracked tile my mother let me ruin. I cried over it. She made me dig the hole myself. Then she gave me another tile. That is how a trade survives. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Marisol Ibarra Reyes, October 9th, 1981. Elena did not move when she reached the signature. The light had strengthened without warming, and the fog had lifted enough for the broken window to show the pale trunk of the nearest live oak. A drop of water fell from the roof into a bucket in the front room. Then another. The sound arrived at even intervals, patient as a metronome. She read the letter again. The second time was slower. Her mouth shaped certain names without voice. Esteban, Lucia, Tomas, Ana Maria, Raphael, Sister Agnes, Dr. Warren. Places gathered on the table as if the paper had opened a map under her hands. Cienfuegos, Ybor City, St. Augustine, Korea, the old city gate. A children's home she had never seen, and yet whose shoes, blankets, medicine, and piano had passed through this room in paper envelopes and exact change. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases. Not new creases, not easier ones. Her fingers found the old lines and obeyed them. She returned it to the envelope, then took it out again because the paper should not be shut away so quickly. Finally, she placed it beneath the blue glass button on the mantel shelf where the stove's cold iron could not reach it. The room looked altered. Though nothing had moved, the money was no longer a rescue lying in a tin. The tools were no longer a lucky discovery. The unfinished sunrise was no longer only beautiful or strange. Everything had weight now, not heavier. More exact. Elena took the brick trowel and went out through the back door. The morning had cleared to a silver dampness. Grass brushed her ankles and left water on her socks. Behind the kiln shed, the path to the marsh was half hidden by grapevine and fallen limbs. The walnut tree nearest the water stood wider than the others, its bark deeply furrowed, its lower limbs spreading toward the open sky. She circled it once before she saw the horseshoe. It was on the west side, exactly as the letter had said. The iron had been nailed there long ago, probably at shoulder height for the woman who placed it. Time had folded the tree around it. Bark rose over the edges like dark bread over the rim of a pan, leaving only the curved center and one nail head visible. Rust had stained the wood below. Lichen grew in the shallow pocket where rain collected. Elena placed her palm beneath it. The ground at the base was thick with walnut shells and wet leaves. She did not dig, not yet. The first ruined tile could remain with the roots until she knew what kind of question to ask of it. Instead, she cleared fallen twigs from around the trunk and set 3 of the better tile fragments she had found in the workroom on a flat stone nearby, amber blue, white, not an offering exactly, more like answering attendance. On her way back, she noticed a narrow shelf above the back door, hidden by a hanging strip of burlap. It held a brass candle holder blackened at the rim and a short beeswax candle wrapped in browned paper. A label was tied around it with thread. Storm Candle, 1162. Do not waste. The wick had leaned to one side. The wax smelled faintly of honey and closed cupboards. Elena carried it inside as carefully as if it were a cup filled to the edge. At the stove, She set the candle holder on the work table, trimmed the wick with the rusted scissors, and struck a match. The flame took slowly. First a blue bead, then a small yellow tongue, then a steady oval no taller than her thumbnail. Its light did not change the room much in daylight, but it changed the table, it warmed the edge of the letter, it found the brass plumb bob, the rosewood trowel, the nippers, the worn apron folded beside them. It made the dust visible in the air, each mote rising and falling without hurry. 60 years was a long time to wait for a match. Elena sat before it until the wax pool widened. When the flame bent, she cupped one hand around it, not because the room was windy, but because protection is sometimes a habit the hand performs before the mind names it. The letter had mentioned kindness without polishing it, not grand charity, not rescue with witnesses, small things carried under the arm, the groundskeeper pointing to the spigot and telling her to fill 2 bottles if she had them, the older couple with boiled peanuts making room beside sacks and salt, Mrs. Whitcomb folding the map rather than merely handing it over, Arthur Hollis putting her name in the ledger and not calling it pity, even the night waitress in Stark, who had let her sit with weak tea until dawn because the booth needed wiping anyway. None of them had known what they were continuing. That was the hidden work of kindness. Elena saw. It often travelled without the giver's name attached. It moved from hand to hand, changed shape, became bus fare. A cup, a map, a warning, a roof not yet repaired, a piano in a room full of children who had already lost too much. And if you're listening now, maybe you have one of those small kindnesses in your own keeping, not the kind that made newspapers, not the kind with speeches, a sandwich handed through a car window, a teacher who stayed after the bell, a neighbour who shovelled your steps without knocking, a stranger who gave directions slowly when you had no strength left to be lost. Tell us about that in the comments if you can. Someone reading may need to be reminded that small mercies do not disappear. They keep travelling, quietly, patiently, sometimes for years. Elena let the candle burn only 7 minutes. Then she pinched the flame with damp fingers, as Abuela Sol had taught her, and watched the thin smoke rise. Waste was not reverence. Reverence was use with memory. Before evening she made a place beside the stove for the heirlooms. She did not leave them in the wall, and she did not scatter them across the room. The tools were wrapped in the apron. The photographs were slid between 2 dry boards weighted flat. The medal stayed in its handkerchief, set on top of the bundle of letters. The tin went beneath the work table, behind a row of tile bins, covered not by secrecy alone but by order. Everything had a place. At dusk, she built a careful fire. The stove drew better than before. Smoke climbed obediently. The room warmed by small degrees, and the candle, cooled now, waited beside the letter with a shallow bowl of wax hardened around its wick. Elena ate rice again, slower this time, with a little salt she had found in a jar and tested first on her tongue. Outside, frogs began their evening work. The marsh darkened. The kiln shed became a black shape against the last light. She unfolded the apron and spread it beside her bedding. The cloth smelled of clay, cedar, and the faint peppery scent of old cotton. She placed the rosewood trowel at one side, her tiny brick trowel at the other, as if the 2 tools needed to lie near each other and make their own acquaintance. The letter, folded in its envelope, rested between them. The medal lay above it. The photographs, still unread in any full sense, were tucked under the edge of the backpack to stay flat. When she lay down, she did not hold the money. Her hand found the apron instead. Its patched corner was rough beneath her fingers. The stove ticked as the fire settled. Somewhere in the wall, the mouse resumed its narrow road. The house was still unsafe, unpaid, condemned in county language, and open to weather in more ways than she could count. But that night, for the first time, Elena slept with the old tools beside her, the letter within reach, and the unfinished sun behind the wall no longer silent. The first snow came on December 3rd. though in that part of Florida it could hardly be called snow by anyone raised farther north. It fell for less than an hour before dawn, a brief white sifting mixed with sleet, and measured not quite half an inch on the kiln shed roof where the cold held longest. By sunrise most of it had turned to clear water along the eaves. Still, Elena stood in the yard with her hands tucked beneath her arms and watched the thin white line on the clay tiles, as if the house had received a letter from another climate. Cold made the leaks more honest. Water no longer wandered down beams and pretended to be harmless. It found the rot, darkened it, and showed where the roof had failed in layers. Above the front room, 3 patches of clay tile were missing. Above the back workroom, rusted sheet metal had been nailed over a hole large enough for daylight. At the kiln shed, the lean-to roof had slipped at its outer edge, pulling nails from the rafters and leaving a gap where marsh wind entered with a low whistle. Elena did not climb that day. She sat at the work table with Arthur's old county manual open to the roofing chapter and read it 3 times. The first reading gave her vocabulary: decking, underlayment, flashing, course, exposure, ridge cap, drip edge. The second reading gave her sequence: inspect first, remove loose material, replace bad wood, lay felt from lower edge upward, overlap, nail pattern. The third reading gave her the warnings, which mattered most because warnings were usually written by people who had already paid for mistakes. On a brown paper grocery bag, she drew the roof in rectangles: front pitch, roughly 26 feet wide and 18 feet from eave to ridge; rear pitch, the same width but shorter where the shed addition changed the angle; kiln lean-to, 12 by 16. She counted not beauty but survival. Enough 30-year asphalt shingles to cover the worst sections, because matching clay tile was for a later year. 1 roll of 30-pound roofing felt, 2 bundles of lath for temporary battens, 5 pounds of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails, 1 tube of roofing cement, 6 pieces of step flashing, 2 sheets of 1/2-inch plywood for the soft decking near the back room, a chalk line, a borrowed ladder. Arthur reviewed her list without praise. You measured the slope or the floor? The floor. Then you did not measure the roof. She took the pencil back and corrected the numbers while he drew a triangle on the counter in carpenter's marks. Rise and run. Waste factor. Lap. A roof was not what it seemed from beneath. A roof had to shed water, not merely cover space. When he finished, he added 1 more item to the ledger without asking. Roofing hatchet. Used? I cannot buy that, Elena said. You are not. Arthur reached beneath the counter and brought out a hatchet with a square pole, a gauge notch near the blade, and a handle dark from years of sweat. The steel had been sharpened down but not spoiled. Initials were burned into the handle, not his. My brother carried it on every roof he worked after the hurricane season of '64, he said. He has been gone 12 years. And I'm tired of moving it from one drawer to another. Elena kept both hands at her sides. I might damage it. It is a roofing hatchet, not a hymn book. She took it then, carefully. The handle fit her palm in the way old tools sometimes do, making no promises and asking no questions. Arthur looked away first. The ladder came through another person. His name was Mr. Leon Pike, though Arthur called him Pike, and everyone else seemed to call him nothing at all unless they needed him. He appeared the next morning in the yard with a 16-foot extension ladder strapped to the top of a white pickup, a thermos under one arm, and a canvas cap pulled low over his brow. He had been a roofer for 40 years, Arthur said, until his knees began sounding like gravel under a boot. Pike was narrow, brown, and exact, with a face folded by weather and eyes the colour of wet bark. He did not shake Elena's hand. He looked at the roof, looked at the ladder, looked at the ground, and said, Bad footing. I can pay a little after the account clears, Elena said, though no account had cleared and both of them knew it. No, I can cook rice. No, I can clean your truck. He turned toward her then, not offended, only finished with negotiation. You can listen. That became the arrangement. For 11 days, the roof took everything morning had to give. Pike would arrive just after 7, always with the same thermos, always moving slowly until he reached the ladder, where slowness became discipline. He would not allow her to work above him until she had shown she could carry shingles one-handed, climb without hugging the rungs, and keep 3 points of contact even when the wind moved. His teaching came in pieces no longer than nails. That board's punky. Step left. Not there. Feel it first. That nail's proud. Pull it. Again and again. No speech wasted. No comfort added. They began with the front pitch because it endangered the room where she slept. Loose clay tiles were lifted and stacked under the walnut tree, not thrown away. Rotten decking near the south edge was cut back to sound wood. Pike showed her how to sister a rafter by setting new lumber against the old, clamping it tight, pre-drilling and fastening with 3-inch structural screws so the new piece carried what the weathered one no longer could. He made her mark the cut twice, then step back and say what the saw would remove before she touched it. Wood forgives some, he said once. Roofs do not. They laid felt from the eave upward, each course overlapping the last. Elena learned to keep the paper taut without tearing it, to nail along the marked lines, to let gravity work with her rather than against her. The chalk line pleased her in a way she did not expect. Pike hooked one end, snapped the blue cord with 2 fingers, and a straight mark appeared where uncertainty had been. After that, every shingle knew where to begin. The 3-stroke nail took longer. Pike could set a roofing nail in 3 blows so cleanly the head lay flat without bruising the shingle. Elena bent the first 6, drove the 7th too deep, left the 8th proud. He made her pull each bad one and patch the hole with roofing cement. No shame in wrong, he said. Shame is leaving it. By the 4th day, her shoulders ached deep enough to wake her at night. By the 7th, the skin at the base of her thumb had split, and she wrapped it in cloth before putting on the gloves. By the 9th, she could read the roof from beneath, where weight had changed, where water had been turned, where one more storm might still find a weakness. They finished the front pitch on December 14th. The back room took 2 more days because the rusted sheet metal had to be removed without pulling half the roof with it. Beneath it, rain had softened the decking around the skylight patch, and Pike made a sound under his breath when he saw it. They replaced only what had to be replaced, not from laziness, but because old houses often depended on connections the eye could not fully explain. Too much removal could become damage wearing the mask of repair. On December 18th, just after noon, Pike climbed down, folded the ladder, and stood in the yard looking at the roof. Elena waited. Her hair had come loose at her temples. Felt dust marked one cheek. A line of blue chalk ran across the cuff of her shirt. "It will shed," Pike said. That was all. For a roof, it was praise enough. The chimney waited until January because Arthur would not sell her mortar in December. "Roof first," he said. Water ruins new mortar faster than old pride. By then the kiln house had begun to behave differently in rain. Drops still found their way through 2 stubborn places near the shed, but the front room no longer received the weather openly. The buckets could be moved aside except during hard storms. The floorboards dried to a lighter colour. The stove held heat through evening, and the front wall no longer wept after fog. The chimney, however, showed its sickness in daylight. From the yard, its north face looked sound enough to a careless person from the ladder, and with Pike standing below muttering what not to do, Elena saw the truth. Spalling bricks along the upper courses had shed their faces in thin red plates. Mortar had powdered between joints where rain entered, and salt worked quietly from within. Near the cap, one brick had cracked from frost or heat shock, and another moved when pressed with 2 fingers. She did not rebuild the chimney. That was beyond her, and she knew it. She repointed what could be saved. Arthur made her write the mix down before he would measure supplies into sacks. 2 parts washed masonry sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, a half part fireclay for the heat-exposed joints near the flue. No Portland cement in the older outer joints because it would be harder than the brick and force the next damage into the masonry itself. Clean water added slowly. Mix for 10 minutes. Slake. Mix again. Use while workable. Keep damp while curing. Mortar is not glue, Arthur said. It is a handshake between bricks. The first week of January held temperatures in the 20s before sunrise and never climbed high enough to make her fingers forget. Elena worked only when the brick face was above freezing. She hung a tarp from 2 poles to block wind and warmed water on the stove, carrying it outside in the enamel cup, because the handle did not burn her hand. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb inside the gloves, and she had to come down, stand by the stove, and flex them until pain returned in pins and sparks. Raking the joints was slow work. She used a narrow cold chisel and a joint rake Arthur had loaned her, removing powdered mortar to a depth of 3/4 of an inch wherever it had failed. Too shallow, the new mortar would skin over and fall away. Too deep, and she risked loosening the brick. Dust came out in pale streams. In some places the old mortar was so tired it could be brushed away with a stiff whisk broom. In others it held firmly, and she left it, because sound work did not deserve punishment. She misted the brick before filling. Dry brick stole water too quickly from new mortar, Arthur had warned, leaving the joint weak before it had begun to cure. She loaded mortar onto a hawk made from scrap plywood and pressed it into the joints with a pointing trowel. First the verticals, then the horizontals, packing from the back forward. Excess fell onto the tarp below and was caught for disposal, not reused after it had touched dirt. Her hands learned the rhythm. Press. Cut. Press again. Wait until thumbprint firm. Strike the joint with a concave jointer. Brush diagonally once the surface lost its shine. Cover with damp burlap if the wind came up. Mist morning and evening for 3 days. Do not admire too early. The upper courses frightened her. Not because of height alone, though the ladder trembled in gusts from the marsh, but because repair above the body's centre makes every movement feel borrowed. Pike came twice without being asked, and stood below with one hand on the ladder, saying almost nothing. Move your knee, less mortar. Brush now. On the coldest morning, the thermometer on the kiln shed read 26 degrees. Elena waited until noon and worked only 90 minutes, but even then her fingertips numbed every quarter hour. She learned to keep 2 pairs of cotton gloves near the stove and switch them as dampness crept through. She learned that masonry work in cold weather was not heroic. It was limited, exact, and easily ruined by impatience. By the 3rd week, the chimney looked less dramatic than the effort deserved. That was often the trouble with proper repair. Nothing glittered, nothing announced itself. The reward was that bricks no longer shifted under pressure, joints no longer shed powder when brushed, and the cap had enough shape to turn rain away from the flue. The test fire came late in January. Elena waited for a dry day with the wind from the west, as Arthur advised, then built a cold start fire no larger than her hand, 1 twist of newspaper, 3 cedar slivers, 2 thumb-thick sticks, damper open, door cracked until draft established. She watched the stove seam, the pipe collar, the thimble, the wall behind it. No smoke entered the room. Outside, she stood in the yard and looked up. A thin column rose from the chimney, pale at first, then nearly invisible against the afternoon sky. It did not coil downward. It did not seep from brick joints. It went clean. Elena stayed there until the little fire died back. Her hands blackened, her sleeves smelling of lime and ash. The house had not become safe. Not yet. But for the first time, its breath went where it was supposed to go. The floors had been waiting under everything. Under dust, under leaves, under broken glass. Under the narrow paths Elena had swept during those first days. In the front room the boards were white pine, wide and uneven, fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails whose dark heads sat irregularly along the joists. In the back workroom, the planks were narrower and more scarred, burned in places by dropped tools or kiln sparks, stained beneath what must once have been glaze buckets, and gouged where tables had been dragged. She began by repairing only what could trip or rot. Pike had shown her how to lift a bad board without destroying its neighbours. Score the paint line. If there is one, find the nails. Work from the end, do not pry from the middle, unless you want 2 broken problems instead of 1 whole one. Arthur sold her 3 salvaged pine planks from a church renovation. Close enough in age to behave kindly, she cut one to replace the board near the front door, where rain had chewed the edge. Another became a patch under the broken window. The third she saved. The rose head nails were too precious to waste. When she lifted a plank, she eased each nail free with a cat's paw and block of wood, then straightened the best ones over a scrap of iron. New nails would have held, but old heads belonged to the floor's face. Where she had to use modern cut nails, she set them slightly back from the old pattern and made a note in the repair book she had begun. February would come. Someone after her might want to know what was original and what had been mercy. The sanding machine came from a rental shelf behind Hollis Hardware. Random Orbit Floor Sander. $14 per day. Payable later only because Arthur wrote it down without looking at her. He included 3 grits of paper and made her repeat the sequence. 80. 120. 220. Yes. Sir. Do not skip. No. Sir. Do not stay in one place. No. Sir. The machine was heavier than it looked and louder than any tool she had used inside the house. The first time she turned it on, it jerked forward and nearly struck the stove leg. She shut it off, stood in the sudden silence, and began again. The 80 grit pass was not for beauty. It took down raised grain, old finish, water roughness, and the thin grey skin of neglect. Dust filled the room despite the collection bag. She wore the mask and still tasted pine at the back of her throat. Under the first pass, the floor changed colour from tired grey to dark honey. Not evenly, never that. Near the stove, the boards kept a smoked amber tone. Near the window, water stains remained like shadows under skin. In the back room, a black crescent where something hot had fallen refused to vanish, and Elena left it after the second pass because sanding deeper would only make a hollow. A floor did not need to forget every mark to become honest. The 120 grit quieted the surface. The 220 made it receive light. She worked in sections because she had nowhere else to put the furniture, and furniture was too grand a word for what remained. A work table shifted to one side, tile bins stacked and covered, stove area protected, the front room cleared by inches. Each evening she swept, vacuumed with an old shop vac borrowed from Pike, then wiped the boards with barely damp rags until the cloth stopped coming away brown. Finish was another lesson. Arthur argued against polyurethane before she had even asked. Too sealed, too shiny, too unforgiving for a house that still breathed damp air off the marsh. He sold her a tin of tung oil cut with citrus solvent, then a smaller bottle of boiled linseed oil for the workroom where scars mattered more than sheen. 3 coats, thin, wipe on, wait 30 minutes, wipe off every bit the wood did not drink. 48 hours cure between coats if the air was damp. No cheating unless she wanted tacky boards that held dust until Judgment Day. The first coat darkened the pine so quickly Elena knelt and watched it move. Dark honey deepened toward mahogany along the oldest boards. The grain rose in slow ribbons. Nail heads became small black stars. Places that had looked ruined took on distinction. A gouge near the work table filled with shadow and became a line in a palm. The patchboard at the door stayed lighter, but honestly so new help beside older endurance. The smell of oil filled the house for days, warm and nutty, clinging to her sleeves. She kept the stove low, rags spread flat outside to dry because Arthur had frightened her thoroughly about combustion, and the front door open when the weather permitted. Every step had to be planned while finish cured. She slept in the back room one night, then the front, then under the kiln, shed overhang when both rooms were too tacky to trust. Near the end of January, she had the bad morning. It did not arrive with drama. No beam fell, no bill came due, no stranger spoke sharply. She woke and could not make her hands close around work. The sander waited, the second coat waited, the chimney mortar needed misting, the ledger showed debt. The tin box remained under the work table, heavy with money she had not spent because spending it too easily felt like failing the hand that had hidden it. She sat on the front step with one boot unlaced until the sun climbed past the walnut branches. Then she stood, walked without taking the trowel, and went to the marsh. The day was clear and cold for Florida, the sky rinsed pale after a night wind. She sat on a fallen piece of coquina where the ground stayed firm and watched a great blue heron move through the shallows. It placed one foot, waited, placed the next. Its neck held a curve so deliberate it seemed drawn by a calligrapher. Once it struck, once it missed. It did not appear embarrassed by either event. Elena did no work that day. She did not call it rest. She did not call it failure. She only watched the heron until light moved from silver to gold. And when she returned, the house had not punished her absence. The boards still waited, the oil still cured, the chimney still stood. The next morning, she wiped the floor clean and began the final coat. February entered through glass that was not there. Of the 8 windows in the Kiln house, 3 had no glass at all, 4 were cracked, and one, the narrow window high on the north wall of the back room, still held its original wavy pane. Arthur said the glass was older than any person living nearby, and Pike, who had opinions about everything nailed into wood, told her not to replace it unless God himself sent a hailstone through. "That one stays," he said. It was not truly dated in any paper Elena had found, but the sash was cypress, pegged at the corners, and the pane held a ripple that bent light like shallow water. Someone had scratched a date into the lower rail, faint beneath paint and dust. 1788, or perhaps 1888 if the first figure had worn down. Arthur leaned toward the earlier date, not because he was certain, but because the little building's foundation had belonged to something older before the Kiln house took its shape. Elena wrote both possibilities in her repair book and underlined, "Do not replace." The other 7 demanded work before spring storms. She began by removing the broken putty, not quickly. Glazing putty hardens into stubborn little ridges that look harmless until a knife slips. She softened what she could with gentle heat from a borrowed lamp, then worked a putty knife under the edge, lifting pieces away from the rabbit. Points came out one by one, tiny triangles of metal darkened by age. Glass shards were wrapped in newspaper and placed in a marked bag. Old houses deserved care, but so did hands. Arthur sold her DAP 33 glazing putty and made her knead it before she left the store. "Cold putty works like bad biscuit dough," he said. At the work table, she rolled it in her palms until it warmed, then pressed a thin bed into the sash before setting each pane. The replacement glass came mismatched from Arthur's back room, salvaged from storm windows, cabinet doors, and one church basement. None of it was perfect. Some panes had faint scratches, one had a bubble near the corner, another held a greenish tint along the edge. Elena chose imperfections deliberately because the house would have rejected glass that looked too new. The technique asked for both pressure and restraint. Set the pane into the bedding putty, press only at the edges, never the center. Install glazier's points every 8 inches, pushed flat with the putty knife. Roll a rope of putty. Lay it along the edge, strike it smooth at a 45-degree angle, 1 clean pull if possible, 2 if necessary, never worrying it to death. Mitre corners with the knife dust lightly if insects were foolish enough to visit before skinning over. Her first line looked like a child had iced a cake. She scraped it out and began again. By the 3rd window, her wrist had learned the angle. By the 5th, she could feel when the putty was too cold, too soft, or carrying a crumb of old paint that would make the line drag. She painted the exterior stops with primer before glazing where bare wood showed, because putty placed against thirsty wood lost its oil and cracked early. Arthur had said that twice. She wrote it down and obeyed. The sash cords were harder. 4 lower sashes had broken cords, leaving counterweights hidden in the pockets like dropped thoughts. Elena pried off the narrow access doors in the jambs and reached inside with the flashlight. The weights were iron, long and heavy, each attached to the memory of a cord that had frayed away. She bought 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, not nylon, because nylon stretched and looked wrong besides. Figure 8 knot at the counterweight. Cord over the pulley, knot into the mortise at the sash side. Test movement before closing the pocket. Wax the track lightly. Do not force a painted joint without scoring it. The first weight slipped from her hand and struck the inside of the wall with a sound so deep she froze, listening for damage. None came. The second she tied properly. By the last, she could raise a sash and feel the counterweight take its burden, not lifting for her, but agreeing to share the work. February light changed the rooms. With glass in place, the wind no longer walked through as if it owned the floor. The stove's warmth stayed longer. Rain struck panes instead of crossing sills. In the back room, the mosaic received morning differently. The unfinished sun no longer looked abandoned to weather, but paused in a room learning how to hold itself together. She saved the high north window for last. Not to replace it, only to clean and secure it. The putty around the original pane had cracked in 2 places, and one glazier's point had rusted away. Working from inside on a low ladder, Elena brushed loose dirt from the sash, pressed new putty only where the old had failed, and set 2 points by hand with the gentlest pressure she could manage. The glass distorted her fingers when she looked through it, making them waver like reeds. Outside, on the nearest walnut branch, a chickadee landed. It was a small bird, black-capped, round-bodied against the grey afternoon. With feet too delicate for the rough bark they held, it cocked its head toward the window and then toward Elena, as if measuring whether she belonged to the room. For several breaths, neither moved. Then the bird struck its beak once against a twig, shook loose a drop of water, and flew toward the marsh. Elena stayed on the ladder with the putty knife in her hand. The last line of glazing was not yet smoothed. The floor below her had taken oil. The roof above her shed rain. The chimney behind her had learned its draught. The windows, one by one, had begun to hold light without surrendering it. By late February, the walls began to show what the roof had spared and what it had not. The kiln house had never been smooth inside. Its plaster carried the irregular breath of the hand that laid it, rising and dipping over hand-split oak lath, with faint straw-coloured hairs caught beneath the lime like threads in old paper. In the front room, the walls were scarred by shelves, hooks, smoke, and weather. In the workroom, they bore a fine clay dust that seemed to have become part of the surface itself. Near the chimney, however, 3 patches had failed. The first was no larger than a dinner plate, a shallow crumble where damp had entered year after year and softened the bond. The second ran in a long wound beside the stovepipe thimble. The third, above the mantel shelf, had bellied away from the lath so quietly that Elena noticed it only when morning light cast a narrow crescent shadow along its edge. She did not knock it all down. Arthur had warned her against the satisfaction of demolition. A wall that had held for generations did not deserve to be stripped because 3 places had given way. She tapped with the handle of her trowel, listening for tight plaster and hollow places, then marked the loose areas with pencil. The sound changed plainly once her ear knew what to hear. Firm plaster answered with a dry click. Failed plaster answered like a closed box. She cut around the damage with a utility knife, then removed only what had already separated. Behind it the oak lath appeared, rough, darkened, and still strong in most places. Some keys of plaster clung between the strips, others had broken off and fallen into the wall cavity long ago. Elena brushed the lath clean with a stiff brush, vacuumed the dust, and misted it lightly so the new lime would not be robbed too quickly. Arthur found horsehair in a paper sack on a top shelf, tied with string and labelled in his brother's handwriting from the 1950s. "Roofers keep strange things," he said. "You are not a plasterer. My brother thought every material might be needed again. It is an annoying virtue until the day it saves you." The hair was clean, springy, and slightly brittle at the ends. Elena teased it apart by hand and mixed it into lime mortar with washed sand, enough to bind but not clump. Arthur made her test a handful by pulling it apart. If the fibres bridged the gap, it would hold. If they balled, she had been lazy. The scratch coat went on first. She pressed it through the lath spaces so it formed keys behind the wood, then scored the face in diagonal lines before it hardened, giving the next coat a place to grip. It looked rough and unpromising, which the manual said was correct. She kept it damp for 2 days, misting morning and evening, shielding it from the stove's strongest heat with a propped sheet of tin. The brown coat followed 3/8 of an inch thick, built out to meet the old plaster without proud edges. She used a straight board to level it gently, not making the wall modern, only making the repair honest. That coat cured 72 hours while the house smelled mineral and clean, like wet stone and rain in a cellar. The finish coat was thin, though 1/8 of an inch. Lime-rich and pale. She floated it with small circles, feathering into the aged surface until the repair could be found by a hand but not by a careless eye. Above the mantel she left the faint irregularity of the wall because it belonged there. Smoothness would have been a lie. When the last patch lost its shine, she stood back with the plaster dust drying white along her wrists. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it softly, not as a boast, but as an instruction given to the wall. Doris from the cafe began leaving paper bags on the step without admitting she had begun. The first bag appeared on a Monday morning after a night of hard rain. It sat beneath the front overhang, folded twice at the top, with a clean stone holding it closed against the wind. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of bean soup, and 3 oranges beginning to soften at their stems. No note, no name, only the faint smell of coffee clinging to the paper. Elena knew the source because the bag had Doris's Cafe stamped on one side in green ink. She carried it back to town that afternoon, folded flat and empty, intending to thank her and settle the matter before it grew into something she could not repay. Doris was wiping the counter when Elena entered. She had copper-coloured hair twisted into a knot, forearms dusted with flour, and a face that seemed stern until one noticed how gently she set cups before tired people. "You left this," Elena said. Doris took the bag, looked inside it, and put it beneath the counter. "Looks used. I cannot pay." "I did not ask. I cannot take food for nothing." Doris lifted a tray of cooling hand pies and slid it into the glass case. "Then pay in candles when the shop reopens." "The shop may not reopen. Then I will wait." That was all she would say. After that, bags came when the weather was worst, or after days when Elena had spent too long on the ladder and walked back from town with her steps close together. Soup, cornbread, a jar of stewed tomatoes. Once, a slice of molasses cake wrapped so carefully it seemed intended for church. Doris never looked toward the Kiln house when Elena passed the cafe. She never asked about the roof, the money, the family, or whether a girl alone in a condemned building understood what people said. She only pushed a cup of coffee across the counter one afternoon and said, "Bad wind coming tonight." The second helper arrived on a Schwinn bicycle with a bent front fender. His name was Caleb Rusk, and he was 15 or 16, all wrists, elbows, and careful glances. He came down the track on a Saturday with a splitting maul balanced across his handlebars and a coil of rope over one shoulder. His hair had been cut at home. One sleeve was shorter than the other. He leaned the bicycle against the walnut tree and stood beside it as if expecting to be sent away. "My mother said you needed wood split." "I did not ask anyone," she said. "Who is your mother?" "Mrs. Rusk, at the laundromat." Elena knew the woman only by sight. A broad-shouldered person with a silver cross at her throat who cleaned lint traps as if maintaining an engine. Caleb looked toward the kiln shed, where the old firewood rack had been emptied, sorted, and partly refilled with salvageable pieces. "I can pay later," Elena said. "No, then I cannot have you work." He tightened one hand on the maul handle. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Elena did not correct him. In some families, every elder collapsed into one useful word. Grandfather, grandmother, ancestor, the person who came before and made a road, even if the road was poorly marked. Caleb split wood with an awkward strength that improved when Elena stopped watching. He set each round upright, lifted the maul too high at first, then learned to let weight fall instead of forcing it. The sound carried through the yard. Wood struck, fibre opened, halves dropped to either side. He stacked what he split under the lean-to with bark side up and spaces for air, the way Arthur had described. At noon, Elena brought him water in the enamel cup and 2 biscuits from Doris's latest bag. He took one. "Take both. My mother said one. Your mother says a great deal." He almost smiled. He returned 3 Saturdays. Never for long, never with many words. On the 3rd he repaired the wood rack without being asked, using scrapboards and nails pulled from a fallen pallet. When he left he did not wave. He mounted the Schwinn, pushed hard twice, and rode back toward the road with the maul balanced neatly across the bars. Reverend Boyd was the easiest helper to misunderstand because he did almost nothing visible. He was pastor of the small white church whose spigot had given Elena water in her first week. Tall, spare, and slow-footed, he walked Old Moultrie every morning in a black coat, polished at the elbows, and a hat that had lost its shape in more than one rain. He passed the mailbox without a door at nearly the same hour each day, and for the first month he did no more than tip his hat toward the track. Then, after the roof held and smoke began rising clean from the chimney, he started walking down the track once a week. He did not enter the house. He did not offer sermons. He did not ask if she had been saved, either spiritually or otherwise. He stood beneath the walnut tree, removed his hat, and looked once toward the building. His face was lined deeply around the mouth, not from smiling or frowning, but from years of holding both until needed. The first time, Elena came out with the trowel still in her hand. "Can I help you?" "Reverend." "No." "Child." He lowered his head. "Keep her steady." "Lord?" 4 words. Then he put on his hat and walked away. After that, the phrase became part of Tuesday mornings when weather allowed. "Keep her steady, Lord." Sometimes he said it while Elena was up a ladder. Sometimes while she stood in the doorway with plaster dust in her hair. Sometimes when she did not appear at all and only heard his low voice through the repaired window. The prayer did not fix timber, raise money, or seal glass. Still, on mornings when her hands shook before beginning, she found that steadiness could arrive through strange doors. Elena postponed the cellar until February 11th. It was not fear exactly. She had opened the wall, she had climbed the roof, she had worked beside a chimney that could have dropped brick through the lean-to if handled badly, but the cellar door, set into the floor behind the backroom table, held a different kind of weighting. Its iron ring had rusted flat against the wood. Its edges were packed with clay dust and grit. For months she had swept around it without lifting. The letter had not mentioned a cellar. That made it feel less like inheritance and more like a question. On February 11th, after 2 dry days and with Caleb's split wood stacked high enough for a week of fires, Elena cleared the work table aside, swept the door, and worked the ring loose with oil and patience. The hinges complained, then gave. Cold air rose at once, damp and mineral, carrying the smell of field stone, old roots, and darkness without mould. 7 granite steps descended beneath the house. They were worn at the centre, each one slightly hollowed by feet older than the kiln room above. Elena stood at the top with the flashlight in one hand and the trowel in the other, though what use a brick trowel would be against darkness she did not know. The beam found walls of fieldstone, close laid and unmortared in places, with shells packed into gaps. A spider retreated into a crack. Something dripped far off, slow and regular. The cellar measured about 12 feet by 15. Its floor was fieldstone too, uneven but dry in the centre. Along one wall stood empty shelves built from cypress planks. Along another were 3 stoneware crocks, 2 cracked, 1 whole. A rusted barrel hoop lay near the steps. There were no trunks, no jars of coins, no secret stair leading anywhere grand, only a working cellar, plain and cold, made to hold what heat would spoil. At the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the fieldstone. It was rectangular, clean-edged, and set with its top level to the surrounding floor. In the middle someone had carved a craft mark, a small rising sun crossed by a trowel, simple enough to be drawn by a child, exact enough to have meant something to the person who cut it. The edges showed no ring, no hinge, no obvious way to lift it. Elena brushed dust from the mark and then removed her hand. She did not lift the slab. Not because she lacked curiosity, because every house had an order, and the order had been teaching her from the first night. Roof before plaster, chimney before fire, floor before furniture. Some sealed things asked for readiness, not appetite. The oak box was found on the way up. Her flashlight caught a straight line beneath the third granite step where a wedge of shadow looked too square to be accident. Kneeling on the stair, she reached under and touched wood, small, dry, wedged tight between stone and the side wall. It took 10 minutes with the trowel and a strip of lath to ease it free without scraping the lid. The box was oak, no larger than a hymnal, with a brass clasp greened at the edge. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in cloth. The key had a long, narrow shaft and a bow shaped like the same mark carved into the granite slab. Rising sun and trowel. It was not for the front door, too fine. Not for any padlock she had seen. Its teeth were cut in a pattern both delicate and deliberate, as if the lock it served had been made by someone who expected patience from metal. The photograph showed a young woman standing before the Kiln house. Not the ruin, not the patched roof and tired sign. A clean building with fresh lime wash, whole windows, a straight chimney, and the tile sign bright above the door. The woman wore a long dark skirt and a white blouse with sleeves rolled above the wrist. In one hand she held a margin trowel. Her hair was pinned back. Her face, though blurred slightly by the old process, had Elena's cheekbones, Elena's mouth, and the same watchful set of the eyes that had looked back from library windows and darkened glass. Elena turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, Ana Maria Solana, daughter of Miguel Solana, age 25, summer of 1903. For several minutes, Elena remained seated on the granite step. The cellar air cooled her ankles. The flashlight beam lay across the wall and slowly dimmed at the edges. Above her, the workroom waited with the unfinished sunrise, the patched plaster, and the tools wrapped in an apron. Below her hand, the oak box rested open, asking nothing more. At last, she returned the photograph to its cloth and carried it upstairs. The brass key she placed on the mantel beside the storm candle. It caught stovelight and held it in a dull gold line. She did not yet know what it opened, that ignorance did not trouble her. Some answers grow roots before they show leaves. Spring arrived first as noise, not bird song, though there was that too, but creek sound beyond the marsh after 3 days of rain. Water moved through the low places with a brown, cold insistence, tugging at reeds, carrying leaves, making the whole edge of the property seem awake under its own skin. The snow and sleet of winter had become a story. The roof no longer told. Moisture still came, but differently now, as weather outside, rather than weather entering. By March, walnut catkins hung from the branches like green-brown tassels. The yard softened, grass pushed through the track. Palmettos showed new spears among the old fronds. The yellow dog returned twice, older each time somehow, sleeping in a patch of sun near the kiln shed and leaving before dusk. Caleb stopped coming once baseball practice began, but one afternoon Elena found a stack of kindling by the door, too neatly split to be accidental. Doris's paper bags came less often, then only when rain was in the forecast. Inside, the house held. That was the largest sentence of spring. The roof shed. The chimney breathed. The floors took footsteps without complaint. The windows rattled in wind but stayed closed. The plaster patches dried pale and firm near the stove. The front room no longer looked rescued by force. It looked tended. The craft itself waited on the other side of all that work. Elena could have begun the sunrise then. She could have mixed mortar, opened the glaze packets, set the circular blanks, and tried to finish what had been hidden behind the cedar disc. But when she stood before the mosaic with the brass plumb bob in hand, she knew the room had not asked for completion yet. The wall had waited through decades, it could wait through one spring. Instead, she made samples. Arthur helped her order a small quantity of white clay and frit through a supplier in Jacksonville. She paid for part of it with 1 silver dime from the loose coins, after writing the date, coin, and purpose in the ledger. Not because the dime had magic in it, because use required witness. The rest she added to the account, which had begun to shrink by inches as she cleaned the hardware store on Thursday evenings and sorted nail drawers in exchange for credit. On the work table, she rolled clay thin, cut small squares and marked each with a pin. Test 1, Test 2, copper 2 green, cobalt half strength, iron wash under clear, rutile at the edge. She did not fire them yet. The kiln still needed inspection, new brick and more courage than spring had given her. But the samples dried beneath the repaired north window, lined in rows like quiet students. In April, she opened the front door each morning and let air move through both rooms. The house smelled of lime, pine oil, cold ash, clay and marsh grass warming outside. On fair days she carried the chair without a seat into the yard and repaired it with scrap wood. Not elegantly, but firmly enough to sit, she wrote in the repair book. She read 2 ledgers. She learned that St. Gertrude's Home had received envelopes in amounts so modest and steady they hurt more than grand gestures would have. She found notations for shoes, dental work, winter coal composition books and 1 small organ repair before the piano arrived years later. No public recognition followed. No family letter. No return from anyone who had closed a door. Elena did not seek them. The work in front of her was enough, and some days more than enough. On the last morning of April, she stood before the unfinished sunrise and held one of the bisque circles from the hidden package. It was smooth at the edge, pale and unglazed, waiting for heat before colour. She placed it back in its stack. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on a December morning in 2024, Elena opened the kiln before sunrise. She did not hurry the latch. The firing had taken 14 hours, counting the slow climb, the careful hold, and the long cooling she forced herself not to interrupt. The kiln, once cleared, patched, relined in 3 damaged places, and taught again to take heat, gave off the faint mineral warmth of work completed in darkness. Outside, frost silvered the grass near the ditch. Inside, the front room held the hush that comes before judgment. She lifted the lid with gloved hands. On the top shelf lay 12 tiles, each 4 inches square, arranged around 3 test strips and a small border piece shaped like a ray. Their glaze had settled into the clay without running. The field colour was not the blue she had expected, but something quieter, a blue-grey like marsh water under winter sky. Along the edges, where she had brushed a thin wash of iron beneath clear glaze, warmth appeared in narrow amber lines. She did not speak. She removed the first tile with tongs and set it on a folded towel, then the second, then the third one had a pinhole near the corner. One had warped slightly because she had rolled the slab too thin. 10 were sound. The ray piece held gold without shouting. When she turned it toward the north window, the glaze broke over its edge in a faint brightness that looked hand-lit. Her first completed work for the house was not a sign, not a commission, not a grand centre for the sunrise. It was a narrow hearth border for the stove, made from clay mixed, cut, dried, glazed, fired, cooled, and set by her own hands. 12 modest tiles, each one imperfect enough to be honest, exact enough to belong. By then, the interior no longer asked visitors to forgive it. The front room had a counter scrubbed clean and oiled, with jars of sorted tile fragments lined along the shelf by colour and thickness. The potbelly stove stood level on a repaired hearth, its pipe blacked and sound, its small border of blue-grey tiles catching firelight in winter. The floors held the deep honey tone the oil had brought forward, darkening near the stove, glowing near the windows. The plaster patches had blended into the walls as if they had always intended to pale there. In the back room, The work table had been braced with new oak stretchers and planed flat enough to receive glass. The mosaic still spread across the eastern wall, but it had changed without being rushed. Missing marsh grass had been repaired, loose rays had been reset. The cedar disc had been cleaned, oiled, and placed back within the sun while the centre still waited. Shelves held glaze tests, labelled cones, small bowls of tesserae, tile nippers, the brass plumb bob, and the rosewood trowel. The storm candle stood under a glass cover beside the letter. The brass key remained on the mantel for nearly 2 years before Elena found its lock. It happened because of a storm. A December nor'easter came up the coast with hard rain and wind that worried the walnut trees for a full day and night. The kiln house held, the roof shed, the windows trembled but stayed. By morning, the yard was littered with branches, and one large limb had torn away from the west side of the oldest walnut, the tree with the horseshoe grown into its bark. Elena went out with a saw, expecting damage. What she found was an opening where the branch had pulled a strip of outer wood free, not a hollow made by rot, though rot had begun at the edges. A narrow brass plate lay beneath the torn bark, greened by age, set into the trunk behind where the horseshoe curved. Most of it had been hidden by living wood. Only the storm had revealed the straight line of metal and the small keyhole at its centre. She stood in rain boots with the saw in her hand and knew before she returned to the house. The brass key was cold from the mantel. Its bow, shaped like the rising sun and trowel, fit between her fingers as if it had been waiting for that grip. Outside, the walnut dripped steadily. She cleared the keyhole with a toothpick, then a soft brush, then tried the key without force. It turned. Inside the tree was a compartment no larger than a bread box, lined in tin and sealed behind the brass plate. The air that came out smelled of metal, dry cloth, and old rain. Elena reached in and drew out a folded flag wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath it a note sealed in a brittle envelope. The flag had 48 stars. Its edges were yellowed, its folds sharp, its cotton heavier than modern cloth. She laid it on the work table and opened the note with a bone folder, moving slowly enough that the paper did not tear. The handwriting was not Marisol's. It was older, with tall loops and a slant that seemed to lean toward the future. March 3, 1919. To the daughter who keeps the fire, and to the daughter after her. This flag came home without the man who carried it. My brother Miguel Solana died in France in the last autumn of the war, near the Meuse, and his belongings were sent back in a crate that smelled of mud and ship smoke. I have placed the flag in the walnut because a tree remembers without speaking, and because houses can burn, but a living trunk will hide what grief cannot bear to see every morning. If you find it, do not sell it. Do not display it for vanity. Take it once, on a proper day, to a place where the dead are named, and let the cloth feel air. Then fold it again and keep it for the next careful hands. Anna Maria Solana, Saltile Yard, Stent, Johns County. Elena read the note twice, as she had read the other one years before. Then she looked at the photograph from 1903, the young woman with her face standing before the clean kiln house. The name on the back now had a voice beside it. Not full, never full, but enough. The proper day came the following November. She chose November 11th because the note had named a war that ended on that date, and because some anniversaries ask less for celebration than attendance. She carried the folded flag, the 1951 medal, and a small tile cross she had made from the blue-grey glaze to the St. Augustine National Cemetery, where white stones stood in ordered rows beneath live oaks. Arthur drove her because he said old flags did not belong on a bus if a truck was available. At the cemetery she found no grave for Miguel Solana, whose body had not returned, and no marker for Raphael, whose service had ended far away. So she stood near the central flagpole with the folded cloth in both hands. Arthur removed his cap. Reverend Boyd, who had come without being asked, said nothing for a long while. Then he offered the same 4 words he had carried down the track in the repair years. Keep her steady, Lord. Elena placed the medal on the folded flag for 1 minute. No longer. No ceremony beyond the act. Then she wrapped both again, as the note instructed, and carried them home. The tile cross remained at the base of a veteran's marker without a family name, because not every remembrance finds its assigned stone. The money did not become a new life in the way outsiders might have expected. Elena spent 3 silver dimes, 1 quarter, and the rain-soft dollar she had saved from those first weeks, each recorded in the ledger with date and purpose, clay order, postage, cemetery flowers, a courthouse copy fee. The rest of the coins remained wrapped, labelled and sealed in the tin. The bills moved to a credit union under an account whose name Arthur helped her form properly, not for spending freely but for preserving the house, the craft, and the next person who might arrive with less than anyone believed survivable. The gold coins were never appraised for sale. They rested in their paper sleeves inside a new cedar box Caleb built from offcuts, with a note in Elena's hand explaining what she knew and what she did not. Beside them lay copies of both letters, not originals. The originals were kept in a fireproof box after Mrs. Whitcomb arranged, through a cousin who worked in archives, to have them flattened, sleeved, and copied without fuss. Mrs. Whitcomb still had the first $5 receipt in a file, though the county no longer needed it. The shop reopened without an announcement. No ribbon. No article. No mayor with scissors. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a lost cat notice and a church supper flyer. Hand-marred tile repairs. Mosaic patching. Small orders only. Sol Reyes tile mosaic. Ask at Hollis Hardware. For 3 weeks, nobody asked. Then a woman brought in 3 broken house number tiles from a 1930s porch. Then a man wanted a cracked garden saint repaired because his wife had loved it and he did not want to buy a new one. Then a bed and breakfast owner asked whether 6 bathroom border tiles could be matched closely enough that guests would not notice the repair. Elena said she could try, which was the most honest answer the trade allowed. By the end of the next year, the mailing list had 43 names. Most were written in a ruled notebook kept at Doris's counter. Some wanted kitchen backsplashes repaired. Some wanted small memorial tiles. One school wanted a mosaic made from broken plates donated by families, though Elena told them it would take time and the children would need to sort by thickness first. Doris wrote beside that name in pencil, Patient Principal. Orders came slowly enough for the house to keep breathing. Elena worked 4 days a week at the table and 1 evening at Hollis Hardware until the account was clear. Arthur tried to mark the final balance paid before she had earned it, and she caught him because his math turned generous. She set the ledger back on the counter and waited. He corrected the number without apology. Marisol would have been worse, he said. Yes. Sir. Caleb returned with the sign in early spring. He was taller then, nearly grown into his wrists, with the same Schwinn bicycle now repainted dark green and a tool roll tied behind the seat. He came down the track on a Saturday and carried a long object wrapped in a quilt. Elena was in the yard, washing glaze buckets. The yellow dog, much older and mostly uninterested in ceremony, lifted his head from the sun and lowered it again. Caleb leaned the wrapped piece against the walnut tree. My mother said you needed a sign. She says a great deal. She does. He unwrapped it without smiling. The sign was hand-carved from cypress. The letters cut deep and painted in dark blue. Not factory even. Not perfect. The border followed the old tile signs pattern. Sun rays at the corners. A small trowel beneath the name. It read, Sol Reyes Daughters. Tile, mosaic, Kiln, work done by hand. Elena looked at the plural word for a long time. There are no daughters, Caleb said, too quickly, as if explaining before he could be corrected. I mean, not right now. My mother said there might have been, or might be, or it should have said that all along. The yard became very still around the sentence. The old sign by the mailbox had kept only fragments. The board above the door had faded to tea. This one stood new enough to embarrass the weather, yet made from wood that would grey. Check. And settle. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, leaving pale clay streaks across the cloth. How much do I owe you? Caleb's face closed at once. No. Caleb, my mother said. Elena. It was the first time he had used her name without miss before it. He looked startled by his own courage, then continued. My mother said some work is paid backward, so the sign went above the door 2 days later, with Arthur holding the ladder, Pike giving unwelcome advice from below, Doris arriving with coffee, and Reverend Boyd standing near the walnut tree with his hat in his hands. No one made a speech. The screws went in straight. The sign settled against the front of the building as if the empty space had been cut for it. That evening, Elena began writing her own letter. She did not know who would open it. She did not know whether the person would come by blood, accident, need, or the strange mercy of a public notice printed on cheap paper. She knew only that houses outlast certainty, and a trade survives better when instructions are written by someone who has actually burned her fingers, bent her nails, overwatered her mortar, and learned where the floor complains. She used cream paper from Mrs. Whitcomb's stationery drawer, bought and paid for. She sharpened a pencil first, though she meant to write in ink. The first draft began badly, with too much explanation. She set it aside. The second tried to sound wise and failed. She set that aside too. On the third, she wrote only what was true. My dear one, whoever you are. Then she stopped and listened. The stove ticked. A jar lid settled on the shelf outside. Wind moved through the walnut catkins, dry and soft. In the back room, the unfinished sunrise held its cedar centre. She had still not set the final tiles. The work around it had grown instead. Samples, commissions, records, repairs, the sign, the flag, the medal, the mailing list, the careful account of money not spent. She dipped the pen again. If you have opened this letter, I hope you came carefully. More would come later, not in one night. Letters, like houses, knew when they were being forced. Near the end of that spring, Elena returned the cedar disc to the wall for the last time before setting the sun's centre. Behind it, in the air pocket, she placed copies of the records, a small envelope of photographs, a list of materials that had worked and those that had failed, and her unfinished letter wrapped in oilskin. She did not include the tin box. That belonged elsewhere now, sealed for the next one, the next careful hands, the next person who might need shelter more than spectacle. The house had been waiting, and now Elena had begun to wait with it. Years do not repair everything. They do not return a frame to a photograph, or make a mother step forward on a hot August afternoon, or bring back lost tools sold before a young woman knew their names. They do not force the greedy to confess, and they do not arrange justice into satisfying scenes. Much of life remains uncorrected in any public way, but some things can still be made honest. A roof can shed rain. A chimney can draw clean. A floor can take weight after rot has been cut away. A window can hold a pane of wavy glass and bend morning into the room. A broken plate can become marsh grass. A failed wall can carry a sunrise for longer than the first maker lived to see. The mosaic and tile Kiln house waits. It has always waited. In Mrs. Whitcomb's desk, in the bottom drawer beneath maps and spare stamp pads, the original 5 $1 bills still rested inside a county envelope, clipped to a copy of the transfer receipt. The clerk had meant to deposit them, then meant to send them through the proper office, then meant to ask, then finally understood that some records are truer when they keep the shape of a beginning. Every so often, when a new clerk complained about surplus parcels or condemned structures nobody wanted, Mrs. Whitcomb would open that drawer and look at the envelope. $5. Exact. Enough. Once. To buy a ruin. Enough. In patient hands. To begin.